It is late, and you are lying in the dark. The world outside is quiet, and the mind is beginning to slow, to drift away from the weight of the day. This is a collection of things you will never need to know, odd little fragments from a time of great noise, now reduced to small, almost meaningless details. Consider it an inventory of the forgotten, a list of the nearly interesting, spoken in a low voice into the dark. Here is a quiet fact to start with. The American military gave us the term snafu to describe the chaos of war. It stands for a situation that is thoroughly and predictably messed up, a state of affairs where nothing goes as planned. Soldiers used it to describe everything from a broken stove to a blown tire, a way to acknowledge the constant, grinding disorder of military life. Then there was fubar, a cousin to snafu, reserved for moments of absolute, unrecoverable disaster, a total breakdown from which there was no coming back. The British Ministry of Information had a strange distaste for the word camouflage. They actually distributed a pamphlet that banned its use in official reports, preferring instead the clunky phrase, deceptive coloring. It was an attempt to control language, to make the act of hiding seem like a more straightforward, less exotic military operation. Of course, soldiers and the public ignored the ruling, and the word stuck. Japanese pilots flying toward Pearl Harbor used the radio call Tora, Tora, Tora to signal that they had achieved complete surprise. The word Tora translates to tiger in Japanese, a strong and fierce image for a surprise attack. But the choice was also practical. It was a phonetic shortening of a longer code phrase meaning to rush, a simple sound that was easy to say quickly and clearly over a crackling radio. In the United States, the Office of Censorship, in a quiet but significant act, asked newspapers to stop reporting the daily weather. Their reasoning was simple. If enemy submarines knew it was foggy or clear off the coast, they could use that information to hunt Allied shipping. So, civilians were left to look out their own windows to see if it would rain, while the military held the nation's weather patterns as a state secret. German radio operators on the Western Front used a very specific technical quirk to their advantage. Their transmitters, when turned on, created a distinctive electronic chirp that was different from the British and American signals. British listeners, whose job it was to monitor these frequencies, could identify the source of the transmission just by the sound of the power surge. They nicknamed this electronic signature the German squeak. The word jeep, that iconic vehicle of the war, has a very mundane origin. It was most likely derived from the abbreviation GP, which stood for General Purpose on Vehicle Requisition Forms. The letters were simply spoken aloud, GP, and over time, the sound of the letters ran together into the word we know today. It is a classic case of military bureaucracy accidentally coining a piece of popular culture. Australian troops had a gentle, slightly patronizing term for their new, untested soldiers. They called them chocolate soldiers, a reference to the idea that they would melt under pressure. The term actually predates the war, but it was revived in the Pacific Theater as a quiet way for veterans to rib the newcomers. It was a small, almost affectionate jab at their inexperience. The British Royal Air Force standardized the phrase, bandits at 12 o'clock, to warn of enemy aircraft. The clock face was used as a simple, universal compass. 12 o'clock meant the danger was directly ahead. This system allowed a pilot to instantly know where to look without having to think about degrees or cardinal directions, a split-second advantage that could save a life. The U.S. Army had a peculiar tradition involving banknotes. Airmen would carry a single dollar bill or a banknote from a foreign country and get their crewmates to sign it. This short snorter book was meant to be kept on your person at all times. It was a form of camaraderie, a physical token of the men you flew with, in a time when life was uncertain. The French resistance used a specific, heavy M sound to authenticate agents over telephone lines. In an era of poor connections and wiretaps, the way a person pronounced the letter M could be a secret signature. If an agent didn't make the sound exactly as expected, the resistance on the other end would know the line was compromised. Soviet soldiers facing the fearsome German 88mm flak gun simply called it the ack-ack. They adopted the German word for the number 8, a small nod of respect for the weapon that caused them so much trouble. It was a simple act of borrowing language from the enemy to describe the enemy. In the US Navy, the term scuttlebutt was used for gossip. This is because the water fountain on a ship was called a scuttlebutt. It was a cask with a hole, a scuttle, in its butt. Sailors would gather around it to drink and talk, and the idle chatter they shared became known by the name of the place where they shared it. The British term for anti-aircraft fire, ack-ack, came directly from the phonetic alphabet. At the time, A was represented by the word ack. So AA guns, which fired at aircraft, became ack-ack guns. It was a simple abbreviation that stuck because it was easy to say and had a certain onomatopoeic quality, mimicking the sound of the guns. The US Army used the code word chow for food deliveries. The origin is a bit murky, but it likely comes from the Chinese word for food, chow. The military adopted it as a slang term for any meal, and because it was short and distinct, it made a good code word for logistics. It became so ingrained that soldiers would ask, "What's for chow?" without thinking about its origins. The German military called their flamethrowers Flammenwerfer, a compound word that literally translates to flamethrower. English speakers found the sound of the German word comical, a strange contrast to the horrific nature of the weapon itself. It was a piece of linguistic dissonance, a silly-sounding word for a terrifying device. The US Marines adopted the term gremlin to explain mechanical failures on their aircraft. The word actually originated in the Royal Air Force, where pilots blamed the mischievous little creatures for any glitch or malfunction. The Marines picked it up and used it in the Pacific, giving a name to the mysterious gremlins that seemed to sabotage their engines. Members of the British Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the WAF, were affectionately nicknamed WAFs. It was a simple shortening of the acronym, turning the formal title into something more personal and casual. It was a way for the women to claim their place in the service, and for the men to acknowledge them with a friendly nickname. The U.S. Women's Army Corps, the WAC, was unique in that it was pronounced as a word, not as separate letters. It was a deliberate choice by the Army to make the acronym sound like a real word, WAC, rather than a sterile administrative designation. The WAC became a recognizable identity, a name with a sound all its own. The Japanese military used the term gyokusai, which translates to shattered jewel, to describe honorable death in battle. It was a piece of official propaganda, a poetic term meant to glorify self-sacrifice. The imagery was stark and final, a jewel deliberately shattered, and it was used to encourage soldiers to fight to the last man. The U.S. Army formalized the term AWOL, for absent without leave, as a formal charge. It was a bureaucratic label for a military crime, but the acronym itself became a piece of everyday language. A soldier who was AWOL was in serious trouble, and the term carried a heavy weight. The British Bevan Boys were conscripted miners, named after the Minister of Labour, Ernest Bevan. During the war, coal was as vital as bullets, and these young men were sent to the mines instead of the front lines. They were a forgotten army, working in the dark, keeping the factories running. The U.S. military called their standard ration the K-ration, which was named not for the letter but for the scientist who developed it, Dr. Ancel Keys. He was a physiologist who created the high-calorie meal for paratroopers. The letter K was a coincidence, but it was easy to remember and pronounce. The term Blitzkrieg was never an official German military term. It was a word coined by the media, a sensational headline that captured the speed and destruction of the German advance. The German army simply called it Bewegungskrieg, or maneuver warfare, a much more technical and less dramatic description. The U.S. Navy had a crude but descriptive nickname for their cooks, belly robbers. It was a term of contempt, suggesting that the cooks were stealing food from the hungry sailors. It was a grumpy bit of slang that revealed the constant low-level dissatisfaction with Navy rations. And finally, the early period of the war was called the Phony War by the newspapers. It was a term for the months of inactivity on the Western Front, from September 1939 to April 1940, when the British and French sat and watched Germany. The term phony captured the surreal calm, the waiting, and the sense that war hadn't really begun. It was a quiet, almost bored name for a strange time. You are still lying in the dark, and the world continues to drift away. The war was a time of enormous maps and tiny, almost invisible lines, decisions made in rooms far away that changed the shape of countries. This is a collection of cartographic curiosities, map errors, border shifts, and the quiet work of those who drew the lines that no one would ever see. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. The Allies printed millions of escape maps for pilots and soldiers on silk. Silk was chosen not for luxury, but for practicality. It was waterproof, it did not rustle when folded, and it could be hidden easily in a uniform pocket. A pilot downed behind enemy lines could pull out a tiny square of silk, unfold it silently in the dark, and find his way home without making a sound. The current border between Germany and Poland, one of the most significant lines in Europe, was largely determined by the Allies' decisions in 1945. They used an old concept called the Curzon line to redraw the map, pushing Poland westward into German territory and shifting the entire country. It was a simple line on a map that moved millions of people and changed the geography of a continent. The U.S. Army Map Service produced a map of Iwo Jima before the invasion that had a significant error. The scale was off by about 200 yards on the beach gradient, which meant the landing craft arrived at a steeper shore than expected. This small cartographic miscalculation altered the entire landing plan, forcing soldiers to wade through deeper water under enemy fire. The Soviet Union shifted its western border by approximately 200 miles after the war. It absorbed territory it had lost in 1921, reclaiming land that had been part of the Russian Empire before the revolution. The border moved quietly on paper, and the people who lived there suddenly found themselves in a different country, speaking a different language. British cartographers were clever in their deception. They deliberately printed false roads on maps of North Africa, hoping that if the maps were captured by German intelligence, they would lead the enemy astray. A tank commander following a British map might find himself stuck in a wadi where the map showed a clear road, a small lie on paper that could have deadly consequences. The city of Kaliningrad was originally called Königsberg, a name that had existed for centuries. In 1946, after the war was over, the Soviet Union renamed it to honor Mikhail Kalinin, a party official who had died that year. The new name erased the German past, a symbolic act of conquest and reclamation. The United States used aerial photography to create the first comprehensive maps of the Himalayan mountains for the Hump supply route. These maps were vital for pilots flying from India to China, navigating through some of the most treacherous terrain in the world. The aerial photographers captured images of peaks and valleys that no cartographer had ever mapped on the ground. The 38th parallel in Korea was chosen as a dividing line by two American colonels, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, in 1945. They used a National Geographic map to pick the line, selecting it because it roughly divided the peninsula in half. It was a quick decision made in a Washington office, with little thought given to the geography or the people who lived there, and it became a permanent division. The Pacific island of Palau was misspelled on early U.S. Navy charts as Palau. This error caused administrative confusion for months, as supply ships and personnel were sent to the wrong destination. The misspelling was a simple typographical error that became a bureaucratic nightmare for the Navy. The German Luftwaffe, surprisingly, relied heavily on pre-war tourist postcards to map parts of the British coastline. They needed detailed information for their bombing raids, and the postcards were a cheap and readily available source. A German navigator might be looking at a picture of a British seaside resort, using it as a guide for dropping bombs. The state of Alaska was considered strategically vital after the war broke out. This led to the construction of the Alaska Highway in 1942, a monumental engineering project that connected the contiguous United States to Alaska through Canada. The highway was built in just 8 months, a testament to the urgency of the moment. The Japanese Navy used hand-drawn charts for the Aleutian Islands that omitted several rocks. These omissions were dangerous for navigation, and on one occasion, a destroyer nearly sank after hitting an uncharted reef. The charts were a reminder of the fragility of knowledge and the deadly cost of a mistake on a map. The U.S. Army Map Service employed 2,000 civilians at its peak during the war. These cartographers worked around the clock, drawing and redrawing lines, producing millions of maps for every theater of the conflict. It was a vast, quiet army of mapmakers, working in offices far from the fighting. The British Ordnance Survey, the national mapping agency, produced 50 million maps during the course of the war. They mapped every inch of the British Isles and much of Europe, their work essential for planning every military operation. The sheer volume of paper was staggering, a paper blizzard that helped guide the guns and the planes. The German Atlas of the East was a publication used to plan resettlement and Germanization in occupied territories. The atlas was a work of brutal bureaucracy, but it was also wildly inaccurate, based on outdated imperial surveys. It was a plan built on a fantasy, a map drawn to fit a vision that never matched reality. The U.S. used the LORAN radio navigation system to map the Pacific in real time. LORAN stations on shore transmitted signals that allowed ships and aircraft to determine their position with remarkable accuracy. It was a technological leap that replaced the guesswork of celestial navigation. The Soviet Union published detailed maps of Berlin in 1943, a full 2 years before they actually took the city. These maps were used to plan the eventual assault, showing every street, building, and railway line. The Soviets were preparing for a battle they knew would come, drawing the map of their future victory. The U.S. Hydrographic Office updated 5,000 nautical charts every year during the war. These charts were essential for the Navy, showing the depths of the oceans and the locations of hazards. A single error on a chart could send a ship to the bottom. The Japanese military in Singapore used maps captured from the British to plan their operations. The British maps were far more accurate than anything the Japanese had produced themselves, and they used them to navigate the Malayan jungle. It was a small irony of war, the victor using the maps of the vanquished. The U.S. Air Age maps were the first to show polar routes for aircraft. These maps used a projection that centered on the North Pole, showing the shortest routes between North America and Europe. They were a new way of seeing the world, one that changed how airmen thought about distance and direction. The British Mercator projection, a standard for centuries, was replaced by the Miller projection for bombing navigation. The Miller projection was less distorted at high latitudes, making it better for navigating over northern Europe. It was a small, technical change that improved the accuracy of bombing runs. The U.S. Geodetic Survey sent surveyors to the Azores, a remote island group in the Atlantic, to measure them for airfields. The island was a vital refueling point for transatlantic flights, and the surveyors mapped the terrain down to the last detail. Their work ensured that the runways were built in the right place, safe and usable. The German Generalstabskarte, or General Staff Map, was the standard military map for Europe. It was a meticulously detailed series of maps, each sheet covering a specific area of the continent. The Germans went to war with a near-complete map of Europe, a cartographic inheritance that gave them a clear advantage. The U.S. Engineer Research Office created 3-dimensional terrain maps for the D-Day landings. These maps showed the hills and beaches of Normandy in miniature, allowing soldiers to visualize the ground they would be attacking. It was the closest thing they could get to seeing the battlefield before they stepped on it. And finally, the Australian Survey Corps mapped New Guinea in a scale of 1/50,000, a level of detail that was essential for jungle warfare. The maps showed every river, ridge, and track, guiding soldiers through a landscape that was otherwise impenetrable. It was quiet, painstaking work that saved lives in the swamps and mountains. The numbers are still falling, settling into the dark like dust. This is a collection of strangely specific statistics, measurements that seem almost too precise to matter. Each one is a small, odd anchor in the vast sea of the war, a number that someone, somewhere, thought was important enough to write down. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. The Victory V sign painted on aircraft required exactly 2.35 seconds of paint application. This was the precise amount of time needed to apply the white paint to the tail section without adding too much weight or causing drag. The maintenance crews had timers, and they counted each second as the spray gun moved across the metal. The U.S. Navy's standard depth charge had a sink rate of 9.8 feet per second. This was not a rough estimate, but a carefully calibrated measurement. The depth settings had to be calculated with this exact speed in mind, so that the charge would explode at precisely the right depth to crack a submarine's hull. The Gibson Girl survival radio weighed 12.5 pounds and was designed to be cranked by hand to produce just 1.5 watts of power. That tiny amount of electricity was enough to send a distress signal hundreds of miles. A downed airman turning the crank would be producing just enough energy to make a pulse of sound across the empty ocean. The United States produced exactly 7,071,000,000 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition between 1941 and 1945. That is a number so large it is almost impossible to imagine, a cascade of brass and lead that fueled the armies of the Pacific and Europe. It represents an industrial effort of staggering scale, each bullet a small piece of a massive machine. The B-29 Superfortress had a pressurization system that maintained a cabin altitude of 8,000 feet even when the aircraft was flying at 30,000 feet. This meant the crew could breathe comfortably, like they were sitting in a mountain cabin, while the thin, freezing air of the stratosphere rushed past the aluminum skin. The British X-class midget submarines were tiny vessels, holding just 4 crew members. They could dive to 300 feet and travel for 1,500 miles on a single charge of their batteries. These miniature submarines were packed into the hulls of larger boats and launched near their targets, a cramped and dangerous way to fight. The U.S. War Production Board mandated that men's suit jackets have no cuffs, no vest, and no extra pockets, a change that saved exactly 14% of the fabric. This small sacrifice was multiplied across millions of garments, freeing up wool and cotton for military uniforms. It was a quiet act of conservation, a minimalism forced by the demands of war. The German Goliath tracked mine was a tiny, remote-controlled vehicle that carried 132 pounds of high explosives. Its top speed was just 6 miles per hour, which was slow enough for a soldier to walk alongside it and steer it with a joystick. It was a strange, lumbering device, a miniature tank that carried a big bang. The U.S. Army Field Ration K contained exactly 2,830 calories in the 1944 version. That was the calculated daily energy requirement for a soldier in combat, a precise number derived from laboratory experiments. Every meal, every packet of powdered eggs and hard biscuit was measured out to keep a man fighting. The Japanese battleship Yamato had 18-inch guns, but each of its shells weighed 3,220 pounds. That is the weight of a small car, hurled across the ocean at incredible speed. The sheer mass of the projectile was its weapon, a crushing blow that could tear through the thickest armor. The RAF's window was chaff, thin strips of metal foil cut to exactly 1/2 inch in width. This specific width was chosen to confuse the German radar systems. When a bomber dropped a bundle of these strips, the radar screen would fill with false echoes, hiding the real aircraft in a cloud of static. The United States produced 4,100,000,000 cigarettes per year for its troops. The military was the largest single purchaser of tobacco in the world, ensuring that every soldier received exactly 10 cigarettes per day. It was a small comfort, a brief moment of calm in the chaos of war, and it was distributed with the precision of ammunition. The U.S. Navy's Mark 13 torpedo weighed 2,216 pounds, a massive cylinder of explosives and fuel. It was a sleek, deadly shape, but it was also heavy and difficult to handle. A man could strain his back just lifting one, a reminder that even the most advanced weapons were still made of heavy, stubborn metal. The German 88mm flak gun, that famous weapon, fired a 20-pound shell at 2,600 feet per second. That is the speed of a supersonic bullet, a projectile that could cross a mile of sky in less than 2 seconds. The shell would be halfway to its target before the sound of the shot even reached the ears of the gunners. The US M1 Garand rifle used an 8-round clip, and the clip itself weighed just 0.2 pounds. It was a tiny, light piece of stamped metal, but it was essential for the operation of the rifle. Without that thin strip of steel, the gun was just a heavy club. The British Sten gun, one of the most famous weapons of the war, cost just $9 to produce. It was a cheap, stamped metal tube that could fire bullets. It was so simple that a home workshop could produce the parts, a weapon of the resistance as much as the regular army. The United States produced 500,000 M2 flamethrowers during the war, each one a terrifying tool of close combat. They were used to clear bunkers and burn out foxholes, spraying a stream of ignited fuel that could reach 50 yards. The production of these weapons was a grim industrial enterprise, a factory line of fire. The German V2 rocket carried a warhead of 1,650 pounds, a high explosive payload that could devastate a city block. The rocket itself was a technological marvel, but the warhead was a simple, deadly weight that fell from the edge of space. The American atomic bomb, the device that ended the war, weighed 9,700 pounds. It was a bulky, ungainly shape, hardly the sleek weapon of science fiction. But inside that heavy casing was a secret that changed the world, a cascade of physics that released the power of the sun. The Japanese Type 93 torpedo had an extraordinary range of 40,000 yards, which is nearly 23 miles. It was a long-range weapon that could be fired from far beyond the horizon, a silent threat that could strike before the enemy even knew it was there. The American B-17 bomber carried a bomb load of 8,000 pounds for short-range missions. This was the weight of 4 cars, dropped from 20,000 feet onto a target below. The load was a mix of high explosive and incendiary, a rain of destruction that fell in a tight pattern. The British Lancaster bomber had a maximum takeoff weight of 68,000 pounds, the weight of a small ship. That included the aircraft itself, the fuel, the crew, and the bombs. It was a heavy, lumbering beast that had to be coaxed into the air by the pilot and the roaring engines. The American P-51 Mustang had a fuel capacity of 269 gallons, a standard amount for a fighter in the European theater. This gave it the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a massive fuel load for a single-engine aircraft. The German Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, had a maximum speed of 559 miles per hour. It was incredibly fast, far faster than the propeller-driven aircraft it was fighting against. But it was also unreliable, and the war ended before it could truly make a difference. And finally, the American M3 half-track could carry 13 troops, a platoon of soldiers, in a single armored vehicle. It had wheels in the front and tracks in the back, a hybrid design for a hybrid war. It was a mobile box that could drive through mud and bullet fire, carrying its passengers to the edge of the battlefield. The food was measured out in ounces and coupons, small portions that had to last a whole week. This is a collection of facts about the logistics of eating, the strange substitutes, and the quiet rituals of mealtime in a world of scarcity. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. The American military developed dehydrated eggs that could be stored for 18 months without refrigeration. The eggs were turned into a powder, a pale yellow dust that could be reconstituted with water. It was a practical solution to the problem of feeding troops on ships and in remote bases, though no one ever claimed it tasted like the real thing. The British national loaf was a wholemeal bread made mandatory in 1942. It was a grayish color and often contained potato flour, which made it dense and heavy. The loaf was designed to be more nutritious than white bread, but it was widely disliked for its texture and flavor, a daily reminder of the war's restrictions. The ack-ack ration initially came in a tropical version that was supposed to withstand the heat of the Pacific. The chocolate and other components would melt into a paste in the sweltering heat of the jungle, forcing soldiers to eat it cold and unappetizing. It was a well-intentioned idea that failed in the reality of the climate. Japanese soldiers carried a compact rice cooker mess kit that could boil water in just 6 minutes. This was a small but significant convenience, allowing a soldier to cook his ration of rice quickly in the field. The efficiency of the kit was a tribute to the importance of rice in the Japanese diet, a staple that had to be prepared even in the most difficult conditions. The U.S. sea ration was a standard meal for soldiers, and it included a small can of B1 meat and a can of B2 bread. These contents remained largely unchanged from 1938, a source of constant complaint from the men who had to eat them day after day. The monotony was a psychological burden, as heavy as the can itself. The German military issued a chocolate called Coca-Cola that contained caffeine, specifically designed to keep pilots awake during long missions. The chocolate had a high caffeine content, making it a stimulant rather than a treat. Pilots would eat a small piece before a sortie, feeling the effect of the drug as they climbed into the cockpit. The United States required that all food shipped to the Pacific be treated with an anti-mold agent called Waxol. The heat and humidity of the tropics were a constant threat to food supplies, and the wax coating was a barrier against spoilage. It was a small, invisible layer of protection that kept the food edible. The British Ministry of Food declared that whale meat was a delicacy to encourage consumption during rationing. The meat was cheap and available, but it had a strong, fishy flavor that the British public found unappealing. The government's campaign was a failure, and the meat was mostly used as pet food. The U.S. military developed a lifeboat ration that was a compressed, vitamin-enriched bar designed to survive 6 weeks in salt water. The bar was almost indestructible, a dense block of calories that could keep a man alive in a life raft. It was a food of last resort, a survival tool rather than a meal. The Italian army issued a trench art wine bottle that was standardized to hold exactly 1 liter. These bottles were practical, but they also became objects of folk art, decorated by soldiers with engravings and paintings. They were a small piece of beauty in the ugliness of the war. The U.S. War Food Administration instructed civilians to save their kitchen fat for ammunition production. From 10 pounds of fat, the government could extract 1 pound of glycerin, which was used to make explosives. Housewives collected their bacon grease in tin cans, a small contribution to the war effort from the kitchen. The Soviet Army distributed frontline kasha packets that contained pre-roasted buckwheat and fat. This was a simple, high-energy meal that could be prepared quickly with boiling water. For a Russian soldier in the cold, a bowl of hot kasha was a moment of comfort. The U.S. D-ration bar was designed by the Hershey Company to be a high-energy chocolate that didn't melt at 120 degrees Fahrenheit. It was almost impossible to chew, and soldiers often had to shave it with their knives to eat it. The bar was a marvel of food science, but it was a triumph of function over flavor. The British fish paste was a standard ration item, a spread made from leftover fish. It was often traded for cigarettes, a sign of its unpopularity with the troops. The paste was a pale, salty mush that was better than nothing, but only just. The German military issued a Keks cracker that was baked twice to last 6 months. This double baking process removed all moisture, making the crackers as hard as rocks. They were a durable, if unpleasant, source of carbohydrates that could survive the rigors of the Russian front. The U.S. 10-in-1 ration was a large box designed to feed 10 men for 1 day. It weighed 25 pounds and contained a variety of canned and packaged foods. It was a logistical unit, a block of calories that could be carried and issued as a single, heavy parcel. The Japanese Navy used a rice ball wrapped in bamboo leaves to prevent spoilage. The leaves acted as a natural preservative, keeping the rice fresh for a day or two. It was a simple, elegant solution, a piece of traditional food technology applied to modern warfare. The U.S. Army canteen cup could be used as a cookpot, holding a full pint of water. It was a simple metal cup, but it was an essential tool for boiling water and heating food. Every soldier carried one, a small, versatile piece of field equipment. The British bully beef was corned beef, imported from Argentina. It was a standard ration item, a tinned meat that was high in protein and easy to ship. It was a reliable source of sustenance, even if it was often the source of jokes and complaints. The U.S. Army bread was baked with a central hole to make it easier to stack and store. This design was based on the concept of the bagel, a practical shape that saved space in the supply chain. It was a small, clever adaptation that improved efficiency by a fraction. The Soviet frontline shi was a cabbage soup served in a tin. It was a simple, hearty broth that was a staple of the Soviet diet. A soldier could open a tin of shi and have a hot meal in minutes, a small comfort in the cold. The U.S. MRE predecessor was a field ration that came with a heater made of calcium oxide. Adding water to the heater produced an exothermic reaction, warming the food without a stove. It was a small, modern convenience that made the soldiers' lives slightly easier. The German ersatz coffee was made from roasted barley and chicory. It looked like coffee but lacked the caffeine and the flavor. It was a substitute born of necessity, a drink that reminded people of what they were missing. The U.S. sugar ration allowed each soldier 3 ounces of sugar per day. This was a small amount, but it was enough to sweeten a cup of coffee or a bowl of oatmeal. It was a taste of sweetness, a small luxury that was strictly measured. And finally, the British wartime pudding used carrots as a sweetener due to the scarcity of sugar. The natural sugars in the carrots gave the pudding a distinctive flavor and texture. It was a clever improvisation, a dessert that turned a vegetable into a treat. The small things are often the ones that matter most. This is a collection of facts about the ordinary objects of the war. The buttons, knives, and canteens that soldiers carried with them every day. The tiny tools of survival that were often overlooked but never forgotten. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. The U.S. Army issued a plastic cigarette holder to pilots to prevent their lips from sticking to the cold oxygen masks at high altitude. The metal of the mask would freeze to the skin, and a simple piece of plastic provided a tiny barrier. It was a small, cheap object that made a miserable flight slightly more bearable. The standard U.S. Army service shoe had exactly 8 eyelets for laces, a number that was standardized for the entire force. This consistency meant that replacement laces could be issued universally, and every soldier could lace his boots the same way. It was a tiny detail of standardization that reduced friction in the supply chain. The German Model 39 grenade had a wooden handle that was hollowed out to hold a small compass. This was a survival tool hidden in plain sight, a compass that was also a weapon. A soldier carrying the grenade was also carrying a navigation aid, a small piece of clever engineering. The British Mae West life vest was made of rubber and could be inflated either by mouth or by a CO2 cartridge. The vest was a bright yellow, a color that was easy to spot in the water. It was named for the famous actress, a nod to her figure, and it saved countless lives. The U.S. military introduced the M1 helmet, which featured a removable steel shell and a phenolic resin liner. The liner was made of a plastic composite that could be worn alone as a protective cap. The two-piece design was a simple but effective innovation that became the standard for decades. The V-mail system photographed letters onto microfilm, reducing the weight of a 45-pound bag of mail to just 1.5 ounces. This was a dramatic reduction in weight and volume, allowing millions of letters to be shipped by air. A soldier's letter home was shrunk to a tiny image, then enlarged again at the other end. The Japanese military issued a senninbari, or thousand-stitch belt, a traditional good luck charm for soldiers. However, production was officially banned by 1943 due to the waste of materials and the superstition involved. The ban was a practical decision, a recognition that resources were better spent on bullets than on charms. The US M2 flamethrower had a fuel capacity of 5 gallons, which gave it a burn time of approximately 10 seconds. That was a short burst of fire, but it was enough to clear a bunker or a cave. The weapon was used in the Pacific, where it was essential for rooting out Japanese defenders. The British ground sheet was a 6 by 6 foot square of rubberized canvas, used for sleeping, shelter, and rain protection. It was a versatile piece of gear that could be a tent, a raincoat, or a stretcher. Every soldier carried one, a square of fabric that was a home away from home. The US M3 fighting knife had a 6.75-inch blade and a leather-wrapped handle. It was a simple, utilitarian design, intended for close combat and utility tasks. The knife was a survival tool, a last resort when the ammunition ran out. The German stealth uniform buttons were made of a material called ton, a type of clay, to avoid metal detection. This was a response to the use of metal detectors by the Allies, a small countermeasure to a small threat. The buttons were indistinguishable from the fabric at a distance. The US GI wristwatch, the A11, was standard issue for pilots and officers. It had a hack feature that allowed the wearer to stop the second hand and synchronize it with other watches. This precision timing was essential for coordinating attacks, a tiny piece of equipment that kept the war on schedule. The US M1938 gas mask bag was made of rubberized canvas and was designed to be carried on the leg. It held the gas mask and a small supply of decontamination materials. The bag was a constant companion, a reminder of the threat of chemical weapons that never fully materialized. The British dispatch rider goggles had anti-glare glass, a small detail that was essential for long rides in the sun or rain. The riders were messengers, carrying orders and dispatches through danger, and the goggles protected their eyes from the elements. They were a small, vital piece of equipment for a dangerous job. The US M1 bayonet was 10 inches long, designed to fit the Garand rifle. It was a long, sharp blade that could be used for more than just fighting. It could cut wood, open cans, and even dig a foxhole. The bayonet was a versatile tool, an extension of the soldier's arm. The German Zippo-style lighters were issued to pilots, but production ceased in 1942 due to a shortage of materials. The lighters were a small luxury, a way to light a cigarette in the cockpit. Their absence was a minor inconvenience, a sign of the war's creeping scarcity. The US entrenching tool had a wooden handle that could be used as a hammer. This was a practical design, reducing the number of tools a soldier had to carry. The handle was made of hickory, a wood that was both strong and shock-absorbent. The British Hawkins grenade was a hollow charge mine the size of a hockey puck. It was a small, flat disc that could be placed under a tank's track. The size was deceptive. The explosive power was significant, enough to disable a heavy vehicle. The US packboard carried 50 pounds of gear, a standard load for a soldier in the field. The board was a simple wooden frame with canvas straps, a design that had not changed in decades. It was a heavy, uncomfortable burden, but it was the only way to carry the essentials. The Japanese canteen was made of aluminum and held 1 liter of water. It was a simple, lightweight design that was easy to carry and refill. In the heat of the Pacific, water was the most precious resource, and the canteen was the soldier's lifeline. The US wool shirt had reinforced elbows, a small detail that extended the life of the garment. Wool was warm and durable, but it wore out quickly at the elbows. The reinforcement was a practical solution, a patch of extra fabric that added weeks of wear. The German field cap had a fold-down ear flap, a simple feature that provided warmth in the winter. The cap was a practical design, one that could be adapted to the weather. It was a small piece of clothing that made a significant difference in the cold of the Russian winter. The US M1910 canteen cover had a small cup hook that allowed the canteen to be attached to a belt or pack. This was a simple, convenient design that kept the canteen within easy reach. The hook was a tiny, almost invisible detail that made the soldier's life easier. The British ground sheet could double as a stretcher, a life-saving innovation in the field. The rubberized canvas was strong enough to carry a wounded man, and the sheet could be quickly converted into a litter. It was a multi-purpose tool that was as useful for saving lives as for sleeping. And finally, the U.S. pup tent could be buttoned together with another tent, creating a larger shelter for two soldiers. This modular design was a simple way to use resources efficiently, allowing the tents to be combined as needed. Two soldiers could share a single shelter, a small act of collaboration in the dark. The animals moved through the war in silence, carrying burdens and delivering messages. This is a collection of facts about the creatures that served alongside soldiers, the quiet work of beasts of burden, and the strange experiments that turned animals into weapons. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. The United States Army employed 20,000 dogs during the war, serving with the Army, Coast Guard, and Marine Corps. These dogs were trained for sentry duty, guarding posts and supplies, and they also carried messages across dangerous terrain. Some were even trained as scouts, leading troops through enemy territory and exposing ambushes before they could spring. The British Army used carrier pigeons extensively, with a peak total of 15,700 birds in service. These pigeons were kept in 157 lofts across all theaters of war, and they were used to carry messages from secret agents and resistance groups in France. The pigeons were reliable messengers, and their losses from enemy action were surprisingly small. The German Wehrmacht relied heavily on horses for transportation, despite the image of a mechanized blitzkrieg. At the start of the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1942, the army had 400,000 horses under its control, pulling artillery and supplies. Horses were the backbone of the German logistics, a quiet, living engine that kept the army moving. The United States Army used mules extensively in the China-Burma-India theater, with some 120,000 mules in service. These animals were trained in the United States and shipped overseas, carrying food, weapons, and ammunition through the dense jungle. Their strength and sure-footedness were essential in terrain where vehicles could not go. The British Chindits, special forces operating behind Japanese lines in Burma, used mules for transport. But to avoid detection, the mules were subjected to a procedure called the Hobdays operation, which removed their voice boxes. The braying of a mule could be heard for miles, so the operation was deemed necessary to keep the raiders silent. The United States experimented with a bizarre weapon called the bat bomb, or Project X-ray. The plan was to attach small incendiary bombs to Mexican free-tailed bats and release them over Japanese cities. The bats would roost in the wooden buildings of Japanese cities, and the timed incendiaries would ignite, causing widespread fires. The bat bomb project was conceived by a dental surgeon named Lytle S. Adams, who was inspired by a trip to Carlsbad Caverns. He proposed the idea to President Roosevelt, who approved it, saying the idea was worth looking into. The project was a strange mix of eccentricity and serious military research. During testing, the bat bombs had a notable accident. A batch of armed bats was accidentally released at the Carlsbad Army Airfield Auxiliary Air Base, and the bats roosted under a fuel tank, incinerating the test range. It was a small, chaotic moment that showed the unpredictability of using animals as weapons. The U.S. Navy took control of the bat bomb project in 1943, spending $2 million on its development. Despite promising tests, the project was cancelled in 1944, as it was believed it would not be ready for combat until mid-1945. The atomic bomb project ultimately overtook the bat bomb, but the bats had already proven their destructive potential. The U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps used reindeer on the Karelian front, where the Soviet Red Army employed them as pack animals. Reindeer were well suited to the harsh Arctic conditions, hauling supplies across the snow and ice where vehicles could not go. They were a quiet, resilient force in a forgotten theater of war. The British Army used camels in North Africa, with some 16,000 camels employed for transport. These animals were well suited to the desert, carrying supplies and equipment across the sand. The camel was a practical choice for a region where water and fuel were scarce. The Japanese Navy attempted to train dolphins for underwater demolition, but the project was abandoned. The idea was to use the dolphins to attach explosives to enemy ships, but the training was difficult and the project was eventually dropped. It was a brief, strange episode in the history of naval warfare. The Soviet Union used dogs to carry explosives to disable enemy tanks, a desperate tactic that was often unsuccessful. The dogs were trained to run under German tanks carrying explosives that would detonate. However, the dogs were often frightened by the noise of battle and ran back to their handlers, causing more casualties than they inflicted. The U.S. Army's War Dog program was established in 1942, training 10,000 dogs for sentry duty. These dogs were used to guard military installations and supply depots, detecting intruders and protecting vital resources. The dogs were a reliable, loyal force, a constant presence at the gates. The German military used messenger dogs with a success rate of 85%, a reliable method of communication in the chaos of battle. The dogs were trained to carry messages between units, a vital task when radio communication was impossible. They were a quiet, dependable link in the chain of command. The British Royal Army Veterinary Corps processed 1 million animals during the war, treating horses, mules, and dogs. The Corps provided medical care for the animals, ensuring they were fit for service. It was a vast, quiet effort to keep the animals healthy. The U.S. military tested skunk gas as a camouflage agent, an attempt to mask the smell of soldiers in the jungle. The idea was to use the scent of skunks to confuse enemy dogs, but the gas was found to be unreliable. It was a small, failed experiment in the science of concealment. The U.S. Project Pigeon was an attempt to use pigeons to guide bombs, but it was cancelled due to lack of funding. The idea was to train pigeons to peck at a target on a screen, steering the bomb toward the target. It was a strange, unsuccessful experiment in animal-guided weaponry. The U.S. K-9 Corps was established to train dogs for sentry duty, but the program was disbanded after the war. The dogs were returned to their owners or adopted by their handlers, a quiet end to their service. The K-9 Corps was a small chapter in the history of the war, a time when dogs were soldiers. The Japanese used carrier pigeons but with limited success, as the birds were often shot down or lost. The Japanese military did not have the same extensive pigeon program as the Allies, and they struggled to use the birds effectively. It was a small disadvantage in the race to communicate. The German Wehrmacht used 2.7 million horses in total, a staggering number of animals that far outnumbered the mechanized vehicles. The German army was largely horse-drawn, a quiet, living engine that moved the war across Europe. The horses were the forgotten soldiers of the Wehrmacht. The Soviet deer battalions transported food in the Arctic, using reindeer to carry supplies to remote outposts. The deer were a vital link in the supply chain, moving food and ammunition across the frozen tundra. They were a quiet, essential presence in the northern theater. The U.S. mule pack carried 200 pounds in mountain terrain, a heavy load for a single animal. The mules were sure-footed and strong, carrying supplies up steep, rocky slopes. They were the lifeline for soldiers fighting in the mountains. The British animal transport used camels in North Africa, where the animals were well suited to the desert. The camels carried water and supplies, moving across the sand with a steady, patient gait. They were a quiet, enduring presence in the desert war. And finally, the United States Army used 50,000 mules in the China-Burma-India theater, transporting supplies through some of the most difficult terrain in the world. These mules were the backbone of the supply chain, moving food, ammunition, and weapons through the jungle. They were a quiet, uncomplaining army, carrying the burden of the war on their backs. The ocean was vast and empty, and the ships that sailed on it were islands of steel and wood. This is a collection of facts about the vessels of the war, the specifications that made them seaworthy, and the small, peculiar details of their design and operation. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. The U.S. Navy's LST, or landing ship, tank, had a ballast system that could flood the tanks to lower the ship by 5 feet. This allowed the ship to ride lower in the water, making it easier to beach itself and offload vehicles directly onto the shore. The system was simple but effective, a key innovation in amphibious warfare. The British Navy used degaussing coils to counter magnetic mines, requiring a specific amperage of 100 amps. The coils generated a magnetic field that neutralized the ship's own magnetic signature, making it invisible to the mines. This was a quiet, invisible defense against a hidden threat. The U.S. Iowa-class battleships had propellers that weighed 18 tons each, massive pieces of bronze that drove the ships through the water. The size of the propellers reflected the scale of the ships, which were among the largest ever built. Each revolution of the propeller moved a vast quantity of water, pushing the ship forward with immense force. The Japanese submarine fleet used a specific Navy oil that was lighter than diesel and easier to refine. This oil was a strategic resource, and its availability was a constant concern for the Japanese Navy. The lighter oil allowed for faster submarines, but it was also more volatile. The U.S. Navy's wooden wonders, the PT boats, had a hull thickness of just 1 inch of mahogany. These small, fast boats were built of wood, a traditional material that was light and strong. The wooden hulls were vulnerable to gunfire, but they were also faster and more maneuverable than metal boats. The British HMS Dreadnought, the ship that had revolutionized naval warfare, was obsolete by 1940, but continued as a training ship. The old battleship was a relic of a previous era, but it was still useful for training new sailors. It was a quiet, forgotten end for a ship that had once changed the course of history. The U.S. Navy issued a standard life raft that contained 10 pounds of dry provisions, enough to sustain a crew for several days. The provisions were packed in a waterproof container, and they were a vital part of the survival equipment. The raft was a small, lonely object in the vastness of the ocean. The German U-boat Type 7 had a pressure hull that could withstand 200 meters of depth, a testament to the strength of its construction. The U-boat crews lived in a cramped, pressurized tube, constantly aware of the water pressure outside. The hull was their only protection against the crushing depths. The U.S. Navy's Fletcher-class destroyers had a length of 376 feet, a standard length for the most numerous destroyer class of the war. These ships were fast and versatile, serving in every theater of the conflict. Their length was a measure of their capability, allowing them to carry a heavy armament. The British used Q-ships, armed merchantmen that concealed 4-inch guns behind fake cargo crates. These decoy ships were designed to lure U-boats to the surface, where they would reveal their hidden guns and open fire. It was a dangerous game of deception, a quiet ambush on the high seas. The U.S. Navy's Essex-class aircraft carriers had a displacement of 27,100 tons, a massive weight of steel and machinery. These carriers were the backbone of the Pacific Fleet, projecting American power across the ocean. The displacement was a measure of their size and strength. The Japanese Type 93 torpedo carried 1,080 pounds of oxygen-propelled explosives, a heavy payload for a ship-killing weapon. The oxygen propellant gave the torpedo a long range and a high speed, making it a deadly threat to Allied ships. The torpedo was a formidable weapon, a quiet killer in the water. The U.S. Navy Liberty ship had a top speed of 11 knots, a slow, steady pace that was sufficient for cargo transport. The ships were built quickly and cheaply, and they were the workhorses of the supply chain. Their slow speed was a reflection of their function, a transport, not a warship. The British HMS Warspite fired her guns over 50,000 times during the war, a remarkable amount for a single battleship. The old ship was a veteran of both world wars, and her guns were fired in every major engagement. The number of rounds was a testament to the intensity of the naval war. The U.S. Gato-class submarine had a range of 11,000 miles, allowing it to patrol the vast expanse of the Pacific. The submarines were the hunters of the ocean, tracking Japanese shipping across thousands of miles of open water. The range was a measure of their endurance. The German Bismarck had a fuel capacity of 8,000 tons, a massive amount of oil that was essential for its operations. The battleship was designed for long-range commerce raiding, and its fuel tanks were filled to capacity. The fuel was a strategic asset, and its availability determined the Bismarck's operations. The U.S. Alaska-class cruisers were designated CB for large cruiser, a designation that reflected their size and role. These ships were a hybrid between a cruiser and a battleship, designed to counter Japanese heavy cruisers. The designation was a bureaucratic quirk, a label that didn't quite fit. The British HMS Rodney fired 375 shells at the Bismarck during the final engagement, a massive bombardment that helped sink the German battleship. The Rodney was an old ship, but her guns were still powerful, and she delivered a decisive blow. The number of shells was a measure of the intensity of the battle. The US PT-109, the boat commanded by John F. Kennedy, was only 80 feet long, a small, nimble vessel in a war of giants. The boat was made of wood and powered by 3 engines, and it was used for patrols and torpedo attacks. Its small size was its strength, allowing it to operate in shallow waters. The Japanese Shokaku-class carriers could carry 84 aircraft, a significant air wing for a carrier of their size. These carriers were the pride of the Japanese fleet, and their aircraft were a threat to any Allied ship. The number of planes was a measure of their striking power. The U.S. Baltimore-class cruisers had a displacement of 13,600 tons, a heavy weight for a cruiser. These ships were armed with heavy guns and were designed to escort aircraft carriers. The displacement was a measure of their armor and armament. The British Tribal-class destroyers had 8 guns in 4 turrets, a powerful armament for a destroyer. These ships were fast and heavily armed, serving as escorts for the fleet. The number of guns was a measure of their firepower. The U.S. Cleveland-class cruisers were the most numerous light cruisers of the war, with 27 ships built. These ships were versatile and reliable, serving in every theater of the war. Their numbers were a measure of the industrial effort that produced them. The German Admiral Graf Spee was scuttled in 1939, a dramatic end to a commerce raider. The ship was trapped by British forces, and its crew scuttled it to avoid capture. The scuttling was a quiet, defiant act, a ship that chose its own end. And finally, the US LSTs could beach itself and offload its cargo in just 3 minutes, a rapid turnaround that was essential for the landings. The speed of the offload was a measure of the LST's design, a flat bottom, and a large bow ramp that allowed vehicles to drive directly onto the beach. It was a quiet, efficient machine, the workhorse of the amphibious war. The sky was vast and empty, and the machines that flew through it were fragile shells of metal and fabric. This is a collection of facts about the aircraft of the war, the peculiar design choices that made them unique, and the small, odd details that were often overlooked. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. The US P-51 Mustang used a laminar flow wing, which was designed at the University of Washington. This wing shape reduced drag and allowed the aircraft to fly faster and farther than its contemporaries. The design was a product of careful aerodynamic research, a quiet improvement that gave the Allies a significant advantage. The British Spitfire had a wing thickness that varied from 13% at the root to 6% at the tip. This complex shape contributed to the aircraft's famous maneuverability and speed. The wing was a masterpiece of engineering, a curved surface that sliced through the air with grace. The German Stuka siren, called the Jericho trumpet, was actually a wind-driven propeller that slowed the plane by 10 miles per hour. The siren was a psychological weapon designed to demoralize the enemy with its terrifying shriek. But the device also had a practical cost, reducing the aircraft's performance by a small margin. The US B-24 Liberator had a 103-foot wingspan that was 12 feet longer than the B-17. This longer wing gave the B-24 a greater range and a higher payload, making it a more efficient bomber. The wing was a key design feature, a long, thin surface that allowed the aircraft to fly farther. The Japanese Zero had a top speed of 331 miles per hour, which was slower than the Corsair, but faster than the Wildcat. The Zero was a lightweight, maneuverable fighter that could outturn almost any opponent. Its speed was a compromise, a trade-off for maneuverability. The U.S. Doolittle Raid used B-25s that were modified to have a range of 2,400 miles. The bombers were stripped of weight and fitted with extra fuel tanks, allowing them to make the one-way trip to Japan. The modifications were a desperate measure, a gamble that paid off. The British Gloucester Meteor was the first jet used by the Allies, entering service in 1944. The aircraft was a technological leap, but it was also a bit of a gamble, an unreliable machine that was still being developed. The Meteor was a sign of things to come, a glimpse of the future of air combat. The U.S. Waco glider was made of wood and fabric, with a capacity for 13 troops. The glider was a fragile craft, towed behind a powered aircraft and released over the target. It was a disposable machine, a one-way ticket to the battlefield. The German V-1 flying bomb used a pulse jet engine that produced a distinctive buzzing sound. This sound was so characteristic that the weapon was nicknamed the buzz bomb by the British. The pulse jet was a simple, crude engine, but it was effective, propelling the bomb to its target. The US P-47 Thunderbolt had a turbocharger located behind the pilot, requiring 14 feet of ducting. This complex system forced air into the engine, allowing the aircraft to perform well at high altitudes. The ducting was a maze of metal tubes, a mechanical heart that powered the fighter. The British used barrage balloons that were 63 feet long, filled with hydrogen. These balloons were tethered to the ground, creating a curtain of cables that could down enemy aircraft. They were a passive defense, a silent sentinel over British cities. The US B-29 had a pressurization system that was a nightmare to maintain, often failing at altitude. The system was essential for the crew, but it was also notoriously unreliable, a constant source of frustration. The maintenance crews worked tirelessly to keep the system working, often with limited success. The US F-4U Corsair had a distinctive gull wing to accommodate the propeller. The inverted gull shape allowed the aircraft to have a shorter landing gear while still providing clearance for the huge propeller. The wing was a practical solution to a design problem, a distinctive feature that made the Corsair instantly recognizable. The British Hawker Hurricane was responsible for 60% of RAF kills in the Battle of Britain. The Hurricane was an older design than the Spitfire, but it was robust and reliable, a workhorse of the defense. The aircraft was a tough, steady fighter that did the lion's share of the work. The US A-20 Havoc was originally called the Boston by the British, a name that reflected its role as a light bomber. The aircraft was a fast, versatile machine used for ground attack and reconnaissance. The name was a small, bureaucratic detail, a different label for a familiar aircraft. The German FW-190 was powered by a radial engine, unlike the inline engine of the Spitfire. The radial engine was air-cooled, making it more reliable in combat, and it gave the aircraft a distinctive, bulky nose. The engine was a practical choice, a robust power plant for a rugged fighter. The US B-26 Marauder had a short wingspan that made landings tricky, earning it the reputation of being a dangerous aircraft. The short wing meant that the aircraft had a high stall speed, making it difficult to land safely. The pilots who flew it had to be skilled, a demanding aircraft for a demanding war. The British de Havilland Mosquito was made of wood, a surprising choice for a high-performance aircraft. The wooden construction was a clever use of non-strategic materials, and it made the aircraft light and fast. The Mosquito was a quiet intruder, a fast, silent bomber that could outrun most fighters. The US P-38 Lightning had a distinctive twin-boom design, with two tails and a central nacelle for the cockpit. The design was unique, giving the aircraft a characteristic silhouette. The twin boom was a practical solution, allowing the aircraft to carry a heavy armament in the central nacelle. The Japanese Ki-61 was powered by a licensed German engine, a Daimler-Benz DB601. This engine gave the Ki-61 a performance that was comparable to the German fighters. The aircraft was a hybrid, a Japanese airframe with a German heart. The US B-17 had a defensive armament of 13.50 caliber machine guns, a formidable array for a bomber. The guns were positioned in turrets and hatches, providing a sphere of fire around the aircraft. The B-17 was a flying fortress, a heavily armed machine that could defend itself. The British Blenheim was a light bomber that was obsolete by 1941, but it was still used in secondary roles. The aircraft was slow and underarmed, a relic of a previous era. It was a quiet, forgotten machine, a reminder of the pace of technological change. The US C-47 was the military version of the DC-3, a reliable, versatile transport aircraft. The C-47 was used to move troops, supplies, and wounded, a workhorse of the air. The aircraft was a sturdy, dependable machine, a symbol of American air power. The German Ju-52 had a corrugated metal fuselage, a distinctive feature that was a throwback to the design of the 1920s. The corrugated skin was a structural feature, adding strength without adding weight. The Ju-52 was a sturdy, reliable transport, a quiet presence in the skies. And finally, the US P-39 Airacobra had a car-style door, a peculiar design feature that was unusual for a fighter aircraft. The door opened like a car, and the pilot had to climb over the side of the cockpit. It was a small, practical detail, a reminder that the aircraft was designed for a specific purpose. The ground was where the war was won and lost, in the mud and the rubble, with machines that were heavy and loud and crude. This is a collection of facts about the weapons that the infantry carried, the specifications that made them effective, and the small, peculiar details of their design and operation. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. The U.S. Army standardized the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle that gave American soldiers a significant advantage in firepower. It used an 8-round en bloc clip that was inserted into the rifle's internal magazine, and when the last round was fired, the empty clip was automatically ejected with a distinctive metallic sound. This sound became a piece of military folklore, with many believing it could alert the enemy that the soldier was reloading. The German MG-42 had a rate of fire of approximately 1,200 rounds per minute, a rate so fast that individual shots blurred together into a sound like tearing cloth. This earned it the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw, a fitting name for a weapon that could suppress an entire platoon with its sheer volume of fire. The sound was intimidating, a constant, terrifying presence on the battlefield. The British designed the Sten gun to be incredibly cheap and easy to produce, costing just $10 per unit. It was a simple weapon, made of stamped metal and requiring minimal welding, a product of desperation after the retreat from Dunkirk. The name was a combination of the designer's initials, Shepard and Turpin, and the first 2 letters of Enfield, the factory where it was produced. The German Panzerfaust was a disposable anti-tank weapon that could penetrate up to 200 millimeters of armor. It was simple enough to be issued to anyone, from teenagers to old men, a last-ditch defense against the Allied tanks. The weapon was effective at close range, but it also produced a dangerous backblast, a reminder of the risks of using it. The Soviet PPSH-41 submachine gun was a rugged and reliable weapon, designed with a thick barrel and minimal moving parts to make it nearly indestructible. It was produced in vast numbers, with over 6 million units manufactured during the war. The weapon used a 71-round drum magazine, though it was prone to jamming and was often replaced by a simpler box magazine. The US M1911 pistol was the standard sidearm for American officers, a powerful handgun that fired a .45 caliber round. It was a proven design, reliable and effective, a last resort in close-quarters combat. The sidearm was often carried as a secondary weapon, a backup when the rifle was empty. The British Bren gun was a light machine gun that used a 30-round magazine, a reliable weapon that was the backbone of the infantry section. It was accurate and dependable, capable of sustained fire, The Bren was a versatile weapon used for both suppressive fire and close support. The US M1 bazooka fired a 2.36-inch rocket, a shoulder-fired weapon designed to defeat enemy armor. It was a relatively new weapon, and it was effective against tanks and bunkers. The bazooka was a portable anti-tank weapon, a tool that gave the infantry a chance against armored vehicles. The German Enz TG-44 was the first assault rifle, a revolutionary weapon that combined the firepower of a submachine gun with the range of a rifle. It was a significant technological advance, influencing the design of future infantry weapons. The TG-44 was a hybrid, a weapon that bridged the gap between rifle and machine gun. The US M1903 Springfield was a bolt-action rifle that was still used for sniping, a relic of the previous war that was still effective in the hands of a marksman. It was a precise weapon, capable of accurate fire at long range. The Springfield was a precision tool, a rifle for the expert shooter. The British Lee Enfield had a 10-round magazine, a fast and accurate rifle that was the standard for the British Empire. It was a rugged weapon, capable of sustained fire in the field. The Lee Enfield was a soldier's companion, a reliable weapon that was trusted in combat. The US M2.50 caliber machine gun was a heavy weapon, used on vehicles and as a ground mount, a powerful tool for engaging aircraft and vehicles. It fired a large, heavy round that could penetrate light armor. The .50 caliber was a heavy-hitting weapon, a force multiplier on the battlefield. The German MG-34 was the predecessor to the MG-42, a well-designed machine gun that was expensive to produce. It was a reliable weapon, but it was also complex and time-consuming to manufacture. The MG-34 was a high-quality weapon, but it was also a drain on resources. The US M7 grenade launcher was a device that could be attached to the Garand rifle, allowing it to fire rifle grenades. This gave the infantrymen an indirect fire capability, a way to engage targets beyond the range of the rifle. The grenade launcher was a simple attachment, a tool that extended the reach of the infantry. The British Boys anti-tank rifle was a large, powerful weapon, but it was obsolete by 1941. The rifle was heavy and difficult to use, and it could not penetrate the armor of modern tanks. The Boys rifle was a relic of a bygone era, a weapon that was ineffective against the tanks of the war. The US M1A1 flamethrower was used in the Pacific, a terrifying weapon that was effective against the Japanese defensive positions. It was a close-range weapon used to clear caves and bunkers. The flamethrower was a brutal tool, a weapon of last resort. The Soviet SVT-40 was a semi-automatic rifle, a design that was intended to give the Soviet infantry more firepower. It was a reliable weapon, but it was not as widely issued as the PPSH. The SVT-40 was a step forward, but it was overshadowed by the submachine gun. The US M1919 machine gun was a versatile weapon used on tripods and on vehicles, a reliable and powerful machine gun. It was a standard weapon, used in a variety of roles. The M1919 was a workhorse, a dependable weapon that could be counted on. The US M2 carbine introduced a selective fire option, a compact weapon that was used by officers and paratroopers. It was a lightweight weapon, easy to carry and easy to use. The carbine was a personal weapon, a tool for self-defense. The German MG-42 had a rate of fire of 1,200 rounds per minute, making it a fearsome weapon on the battlefield. The sound was a constant roar, a wall of lead that was almost impossible to cross. The MG-42 was a terror, a weapon that dominated the battlefield. The US M1 Garand was a reliable weapon, but it had a peculiar flaw. The empty clip was ejected with a distinctive ping sound. This sound became a part of the myth of the rifle, but it was unlikely that it ever cost a soldier his life. Ping was a small, memorable detail, a sound that is still associated with the rifle. The British Sten gun was a simple weapon, but it was effective in close-quarters combat. It was used by commandos, paratroopers, and resistance fighters, a weapon that was cheap and easy to conceal. The Sten was a weapon of the people, a tool for the partisan. The US M3 grease gun was a stamped metal submachine gun, designed to be cheap and easy to produce. It looked like a mechanic's grease gun, a utilitarian design for a utilitarian weapon. The M3 was a simple, effective weapon, a tool for the soldier. The Soviet PPSH-41 was a rugged weapon, but it was also heavy, weighing nearly 9 pounds without the magazine. It was a weapon that was not easy to carry, but it was also almost indestructible. The PPSH was a heavy, reliable weapon, a tool for the Soviet infantry. And finally, the US M1911 pistol was a powerful weapon, but it was also heavy, weighing over 2 pounds unloaded. It was a weapon that was carried by officers and specialists, a reliable sidearm. The M1911 was a heavy, dependable weapon, a tool for the war. The body is a fragile machine, and the war was a constant assault on its limits. This is a collection of facts about the medicine, hygiene, and physical standards of the war, the small, quiet efforts to keep soldiers healthy and fighting. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. The U.S. Army required that recruits have a minimum of 18 inches of waist expansion for physical readiness, a standard that was designed to ensure some degree of physical conditioning. The measurement was taken from the resting position to full expansion, a test of the body's flexibility and range of motion. It was a small, bureaucratic detail, a physical requirement that was often overlooked. The U.S. issued atabrine tablets, a drug also known as quinacrine, to prevent malaria in the Pacific Theater. The drug was effective, but it had a peculiar side effect. It turned the skin a temporary yellow color, a visible sign that the soldier was taking his prophylaxis. The yellowing was a harmless effect, but it was a constant, visible reminder of the threat of the disease. The drug accumulated in the tissues and was slowly excreted, and it was known to be present in the nails a year or more after regular oral ingestion had been stopped. The British developed a water purification tablet that used iodine to kill bacteria, a simple, effective solution for making water safe to drink. The tablet was small and easy to carry, a vital piece of equipment for soldiers in the field. The iodine tablet was a lifesaver, a small chemical guardian against waterborne disease. The military specification for this iodine-releasing tablet, buffered to lower the pH of treated water, was considered the nearest to a universal canteen disinfectant at the time. The U.S. Army's medic bag contained 2 pounds of sulfa powder for wound treatment, a powerful antibacterial agent that was used to prevent infection. The powder was sprinkled directly onto open wounds before applying a sterile dressing, a simple, effective way to fight infection. The sulfa powder was a battlefield miracle, a small, white powder that saved countless lives. The German military issued a personal hygiene kit with a toothbrush and a small mirror, a simple, practical set for maintaining basic cleanliness in the field. The kit was a small, personal item, a reminder of the importance of hygiene. The toothbrush and mirror were essential for morale, small comforts in a harsh environment. The U.S. canteen had a capacity of 2 quarts, often used for cooking as well as drinking, a versatile piece of equipment for the soldier. The canteen was a simple metal container, but it was also a pot for boiling water and heating food. The 2-quart capacity was a practical size, enough for a day's water supply. The British battle dress uniform had a gas flap to protect the neck, a simple piece of fabric that was designed to prevent gas from entering the uniform. The gas flap was a feature of the 1937 pattern Woolfield trouser, and it was also seen on shirts, though the decision was made to forego the extra material after 1942. The flap was a small, practical detail, a reminder of the threat of chemical warfare. The shirt had a similar interior flap of material stamped gas flap that fastened beneath the front button closure to prevent gas from entering the soldier's shirt when worn. The U.S. Army mandated a dental examination for all recruits, rejecting those with more than 2 cavities, a surprisingly strict standard for military service. The rejection rate was significant, a reflection of the poor dental health of the American population. The dental examination was a small, bureaucratic hurdle, a test of the recruit's overall health. The Japanese military issued a field surgical set with 15 instruments, a compact, portable kit for performing surgery in the field. The set was a complete, compact field autopsy set, weighing 22 pounds and containing all the instruments necessary for a complete autopsy, arranged in 2 removable aluminum alloy trays. The set was a testament to the importance of medical care, a tool for the battlefield surgeon. The U.S. life raft included a sunscreen ointment to prevent burns, a small but important item for survivors adrift in the ocean. The ointment was a practical measure, a defense against the harshness of the sun. The sunscreen was a small comfort, a way to prevent pain in an already desperate situation. The German Afrika Korps issued pith helmets, but they were often traded for peaked caps, a sign of the soldiers' preference for a more traditional headgear. The pith helmet was a practical choice for the desert, but it was not popular with the troops. The peaked cap was a more comfortable, more familiar piece of clothing. The US M9 helmet liner was made of a plastic composite, a material that was lighter and stronger than the previous fiber liners. The liner was a modern material, a small technological advance that made the helmet more comfortable. The plastic liner was a small improvement, a detail that was often overlooked. The U.S. Medical Corps used a plasma transfusion system, a method of providing fluids and proteins to wounded soldiers. The blood and plasma program was a massive effort, with blood collected from civilians and military personnel, processed and shipped to the front lines. The plasma was a lifesaver, a way to treat shock and blood loss. The British established field transfusion units, FTUs, to complement the field surgical units, FSUs, each staffed by a medical orderly and 4 other ranks specializing in blood transfusion. The British dressing was a shell dressing with a pad, a standard item for treating wounds. The dressing was a simple, sterile pad, designed to absorb blood and protect the wound from infection. The dressing was a basic, essential tool for the medic. The U.S. first aid pouch contained a tourniquet, a device for stopping severe bleeding. The pouch was a small, personal item, a life-saving tool that was carried by every soldier. The tourniquet was a simple, effective device, a last resort for controlling bleeding. The German sanitator, or medic, carried a morphine syringe, a powerful painkiller that was used to relieve the suffering of the wounded. The syringe was a small, precious item, a way to ease the pain of a wounded soldier. The morphine was a comfort, a small mercy in the chaos of battle. The U.S. aureomycin was developed in 1945, a new antibiotic that was effective against a wide range of infections. The drug was discovered by Benjamin Duggar, who found a golden mold in a soil sample from the University of Missouri. The mold, later named Streptomyces aureofaciens, produced a golden antibiotic that was christened aureomycin, and it was effective against 90% of bacteria-caused infections. Unlike penicillin, it could be taken orally. The British malaria control used DDT, but it was limited, a chemical insecticide that was used to control the mosquito population. DDT was a controversial substance, but it was effective in reducing the incidence of malaria. The use of DDT was a small chemical war against a disease-carrying insect. The U.S. field hospital could handle 400 casualties per day, a massive volume of medical care in a forward area. The field hospital was a miracle of organization, a place where wounded soldiers could receive life-saving surgery. The capacity was a measure of the scale of the conflict, a reflection of the number of casualties. The Japanese medical orderlies were often unarmed, a testament to their status as non-combatants. They were often the only medical care available for wounded Japanese soldiers, and they were respected by their comrades. The medical orderlies were a vital part of the Japanese army, a source of care in a brutal conflict. The U.S. penicillin was widely used by 1944, a miracle drug that was produced in massive quantities for the military. The mass production of penicillin was a triumph of industrial engineering, a way to save countless lives. The drug was a battlefield wonder, a cure for infections that had once been fatal. The British Blood Bank was established in 1941, a system for collecting and storing blood for transfusions. The blood bank was a vital part of the medical infrastructure, a way to ensure a supply of blood for the wounded. The bank was a lifesaver, a place where blood was collected and stored. The U.S. body armor was tested but not issued, a project that was not deemed practical for widespread use. The armor was heavy and cumbersome, and it was not popular with the troops. The body armor was a failed experiment, a relic of a project that was ahead of its time. The German medic had a Red Cross armband, a clear symbol of their non-combatant status. The armband was a small, red piece of cloth, a sign of their role as healers. The medic was a protector, a figure of mercy in the midst of war. And finally, the U.S. vaccination against tetanus was standard, a simple, effective way to prevent a deadly infection. The vaccine was a small injection, a tiny shield against a deadly disease. The vaccination was a standard procedure, a small medical act that saved lives. The names of things carry their own quiet histories, small stories embedded in the syllables we speak without thinking. This is a collection of facts about the etymology of weaponry, the secular origins of the words that defined an era of conflict, and the strange, forgotten paths that led to their naming. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. The bazooka was named after a musical instrument invented by radio comedian Bob Burns in the 1910s. The instrument was a crude trombone-like device made of gas pipes, and the name itself came from bazoo, a slang term for a boastful talker. When the U.S. Army's new anti-tank rocket launcher was introduced, its appearance reminded soldiers of Burns's bizarre instrument, and the name stuck. The Jeep likely derived from GP, the abbreviation for general purpose used on vehicle requisition forms. The letters were simply spoken aloud, and over time, GP became the word we know today. It was a bureaucratic shorthand that accidentally became a cultural icon. The Stuka is a contraction of the German word Sturzkampfflugzeug, which literally means dive bomber. The components break down into the Sturz for a fall, Kampf for battle, and Flugzeug for aircraft. It was a practical, descriptive name for a terrifying machine. The Tommy gun is named after the Thompson submachine gun, which was named for its designer, John T. Thompson. It was a simple transfer of a surname to a weapon, a common pattern in the naming of firearms. The nickname Tommy added a casual, almost friendly tone to a deadly object. The Sherman tank was named by the British after the American Civil War general William Tecumseh Sherman. The British had a tradition of naming their American-made tanks after American generals, a small nod to their ally across the Atlantic. The name was chosen for its historical resonance. The Liberty ship was named by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who referenced Patrick Henry's famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death," during the launch of the first vessel. The ships were originally called emergency ships, but Roosevelt's speech gave them a name that carried a weight of symbolism. The Spitfire was named by the aircraft's manufacturer, Vickers Armstrongs. The name likely referred to the aircraft's temperamental and fiery handling characteristics. It was a fitting name for a fighter that would become the symbol of British resistance. The Bofors gun is named after the Swedish company that manufactured it, Bofors AB. The company had been involved in the iron industry since 1646, and its name became synonymous with the famous 40mm anti-aircraft gun that was used by both sides during the war. The Lee Enfield rifle combines the names of its designer, James Paris Lee, and the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield. Lee was an American designer who created the bolt action, while Enfield was the British factory where the rifle was produced. The name was a marriage of American innovation and British manufacturing. The Panzer is simply the German word for armor or tank. It was a straightforward descriptive term for the armored vehicles that formed the core of the German military. There was no myth or legend behind it, just a practical name for a practical machine. The Mitsubishi Zero is named after the Japanese designation for the aircraft, the ration, or Type 0, which referred to the imperial year 2600, the year of its introduction. The name was a bureaucratic designation that became a symbol of Japanese air power. The Flying Fortress was a marketing term coined by Boeing, not a military designation. The company wanted to emphasize the aircraft's heavy defensive armament, and the name was a piece of advertising that stuck. The military adopted the nickname, and it became the official name of the B-17. The Garand rifle is named for John C. Garand, a Canadian-born designer who worked at the Springfield Armory. He was a quiet, dedicated engineer who perfected the semi-automatic rifle that would become the standard issue for the U.S. Army. The name was a simple tribute to the man who designed it. The Sten gun combines the initials of its designers, Reginald Shepard and Harold Turpin, with the EN from Enfield, the factory where it was produced. It was a hybrid name, a blend of acronymy and abbreviation that reflected the gun's hybrid nature. The Sten was a crude, cheap weapon, and its name was a reflection of its origins. The Bren gun is named for Brno, Czechoslovakia, where the original design was developed, and Enfield, where it was manufactured in Britain. The name was a blending of two city names, a nod to the international collaboration that produced the weapon. The Bren was a reliable, accurate machine gun that remained in service for decades. The carbine comes from a French word for a cavalry soldier, a term that was applied to the shorter, lighter rifles used by mounted troops. The name was a reflection of the weapon's intended use, a tool for soldiers on horseback. The howitzer comes from a Czech word for a catapult, a term that was adapted for the short-barreled artillery pieces that fired in a high trajectory. The name was a linguistic fossil, a reminder of an earlier era of warfare. The Mauser rifle is named for the Mauser brothers, German gunsmiths who developed a series of successful bolt-action rifles. The name became a standard for military rifles, a mark of quality and reliability. The parabellum pistol is named for the Latin phrase si vis pacem, parabellum, which means if you want peace, prepare for war. The name was a piece of classical quotation, a motto for a weapon of war. The Luger is named for Georg Luger, its German designer, who developed the distinctive toggle lock action that made the pistol famous. The name was a simple surname, a tribute to the man who created an iconic weapon. The Browning machine gun is named for John M. Browning, an American firearms designer who created some of the most successful weapons of the 20th century. The name became a byword for reliability and firepower. The Nambu pistol is named for Kijiro Nambu, its Japanese designer, who was influenced by the German Mauser and Luger pistols. The name was a simple surname, a reflection of the Japanese military's effort to develop its own sidearm. The Thompson submachine gun is named for John T. Thompson, the American general who advocated for its development. The name was a tribute to the man who championed the weapon, a Tommy gun, that became a symbol of the gangster era. The Schmeisser was a nickname for the German MP-40 submachine gun, but it was not designed by Hugo Schmeisser. The nickname was a popular misattribution, a case of mistaken identity in the history of small arms. The MP-40 was a weapon of the common soldier, and its name was a badge of its ubiquity. And finally, the Katyusha rocket was named after a Russian folk song, a piece of popular culture that was adopted for the devastating rocket launcher. The name was a small, sentimental nod to the Russian soul, a contrast to the brutal efficiency of the weapon itself. The sky above the battlefield was a river of air, moving in ways that could not be seen but could be felt, shaping every mission and every maneuver. This is a collection of facts about the silent, invisible force of weather, the forecasts that launched invasions, the storms that sank ships, and the strange, forgotten battle to know what the wind would do next. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. During World War II, military pilots flying over the Pacific encountered extreme turbulence high in the atmosphere, a buffeting that was both violent and strange. They also noticed something else. When they flew eastward in one of these zones, they arrived at their destination much faster than expected. These observations, collected over time, led directly to the discovery of the jet stream, a powerful high-altitude river of wind that would change aviation forever. The jet stream was later named by Carl Gustaf Rossby, a Swedish meteorologist who founded the country's first meteorology program at MIT in 1928. He also gave the discipline mathematical rigor, designed the curriculum for thousands of World War II military forecasters, and pioneered the analysis of the atmosphere as a dynamic three-dimensional system. The red and blue lines denoting warm and cold fronts on modern weather maps were Rossby's idea. One of the most important weather forecasts ever made came in June 1944. Meteorologist Group Captain James Stagg of the Royal Air Force persuaded General Eisenhower to change the date of the Allied invasion of Europe from the 5th to the 6th of June, a decision that hinged on a narrow window of clearing weather. The critical patrol that provided the data for this decision experienced such severe conditions that its crew's reports were initially deemed too extreme to be believed. The Allies and Germans fought a quiet, forgotten weather war in the North Atlantic and the Arctic. Both sides tried to gain a monopoly on weather data, as meteorological intelligence was vital for military planning and the routing of ships. The Allies had a distinct geographical advantage, controlling Greenland, Iceland, and Great Britain, which allowed them to track weather fronts as they moved eastward across the Atlantic. The German military relied on weather ships, often converted fishing vessels, to collect observations from remote parts of the ocean. These ships would be out at sea for 3 to 5 weeks and carried Enigma machines to transmit their weather reports in cipher. However, their radio reports exposed their location to British direction-finding systems, and the captured Enigma materials from boarded weather ships, like the Lauenburg and München, provided invaluable intelligence to Bletchley Park. Weather stations were also established on remote land masses. The Germans set up clandestine and automated weather stations on contested locations, such as Spitsbergen, and even on Allied shores, including one automated station in Labrador, disguised as a Canadian installation. The Allies destroyed the weather station on Bear Island and later, one on Spitsbergen, after it had transmitted false information to discourage air observation. The American military's need for accurate weather data led to the creation of a massive training program. At the start of the war, the U.S. had only a few hundred trained meteorologists. By the end of the war, over 10,000 officers had completed graduate-level training in meteorology, with the curriculum designed by Rossby. This program transformed weather forecasting from a guessing game into a rigorous applied science. The U.S. Army Air Forces established a weather service that was essential for all air operations. Before the war, the Weather Bureau maintained a network for commercial aviation, but the military's needs were far greater. By 1942, the Army had entered 440 cadet students into meteorology training, and by the end of the year, the requirement had jumped to 4,000 weather officers. In the Pacific Theater, forecasting was a constant challenge. At the outset of the war, virtually nothing was known about the weather in this vast area. Remote and lacking reporting centers, the Allies had to rely on aircraft reconnaissance, ship reports, and army outposts. Pilot balloons often vanished into low cloud before their ascent could be read, and equipment was susceptible to damage from the tropical environment. Weather also played a key role in the initial decoding of the German Enigma code. Codebreakers discovered that the Germans transmitted coded weather data, which provided a consistent source of known plaintext that could be used to break the cipher. This was a small, quiet advantage that grew from the enemy's need to know the weather. The Germans established the Großraumwettererkundungsstaffel, or WW2, a special weather reconnaissance unit of the Luftwaffe. By the war's end, there were 12 squadrons with nearly 1,000 flight crews, flying converted bombers like the Ju-88 on long, lonely missions over the cold northern oceans. The locals nicknamed them the Weather Willies. Pilots in the Pacific also used weather for navigation. Regular thunderstorms that formed over the Tiwi Islands, north of Darwin, Australia, were used by pilots as a reliable navigation aid to find their way back home. They called these massive, towering storms by the name Hector. The weather at the end of the war may have left a faint mark on the global climate. The massive bombing campaigns over Japan in 1945 burned an area of 461 square kilometers in 69 cities and produced plumes of thick, dark smoke that rose high into the atmosphere. Climate models have estimated that this soot could have caused a detectable cooling of about 0.1 degrees Celsius globally and 0.2 degrees Celsius in the Northern Hemisphere in 1945. The Weather Bureau issued frost warnings that affected troop positioning. In the Aleutian Campaign, fog grounded aircraft for weeks. A typhoon in the Pacific in December 1944 sank several ships and killed hundreds of men. The weather was a constant, indifferent force, a presence on the battlefield that was as powerful as any army. The winter of 1939-1940 was the coldest in Northern Europe in over a century, a sudden reversal of a warming trend that had lasted for decades. Some have speculated that the immense naval activity in the North and Baltic Seas churned up the water, affecting the regional heat budget and contributing to the cooling. The war was so large, it might have altered the very air around it. The Atlantic Weather War was a contest for the future of the world, fought with barometers and radiosondes. The Allies broadcast bogus weather data into Germany to confuse the enemy. The Germans, in turn, used weather ships, long-range aircraft, and clandestine stations, each one a piece in a vast global chessboard. The Army's pre-meteorology program was intended to protect students from the draft, but it was based on a gross overestimate of actual needs. By May 1943, the Air Staff realized that they would have enough weather officers to meet all their needs through 1944, less than half of the total called for in existing programs. The role of ships in transporting troops required improved knowledge of the effect of wind on the sea. Large-scale military operations required forecasts several days ahead. The Met staff of World War II are largely forgotten today, but they provided a vital service on both sides, influencing the timing of every major operation. The world of weather is a world of high-altitude rivers and shifting air masses, a system of waves and collisions that can be measured and understood. It is a quiet, invisible force, a constant presence in the background of human conflict. The systems of naming and numbering that emerged during the war were a quiet, bureaucratic response to chaos, a way to bring order to the overwhelming scale of production. This is a collection of facts about those alphanumeric systems, the codes and designations used by all sides, and the strange, forgotten categories that defined the weapons of the war. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. The Allies' need to estimate German tank production led to a remarkable statistical solution known as the German tank problem. By analyzing the serial numbers on captured or destroyed tank components, such as gearboxes, chassis, and wheels, intelligence officers could infer the total number of tanks produced. The formula was simple. The highest serial number observed, combined with the sample size, provided a surprisingly accurate estimate of the population total. The statisticians used the formula m-1, s plus 1 per cent, s, where m was the highest serial number and s was the sample size. The results were far more accurate than conventional intelligence estimates, which often wildly overestimated German production. For example, Allied intelligence estimated that the Germans were producing 1,400 tanks a month between June 1940 and September 1942. The statistical estimate, based on serial numbers, was just 246 per month. After the war, captured German records revealed the actual figure was 245 per month, almost exactly matching the statisticians' calculations and representing less than 1/5 of the intelligence estimate. In a similar vein, the Japanese had their own elaborate system for designating aircraft and ordnance. The Imperial Japanese Navy used a type number system based on the imperial year, the year marking the continuity of Japanese emperors from the foundation of the empire in 660 BC. For instance, an aircraft accepted for production in 1937, which was the 2597th year of the Empire, was designated as a Type 97. 1940 was the 2600th year, so the system was reset to single digits, leading to the designation Type 0, as in the famous Zero fighter. The Japanese Army used a similar system, but with a slightly different approach. Both Army and Navy systems assigned a type number based on the Japanese year, followed by a description of the aircraft's primary function, such as carrier fighter or heavy bomber. This system was used for all weapons and equipment, a bureaucratic framework that extended to everything from rifles to bombs. The Japanese Navy employed a complex designator for bombs, with type disclosing the year adopted, number providing the weight in kilograms, and mark specifying if it was a special bomb for a particular purpose, such as anti-submarine or incendiary. The complexity of Japanese designation systems was so confusing to the Allies that they created a fifth, entirely separate codename system. In July 1942, Frank T. McCoy, head of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit in the Southwest Pacific, was responsible for creating the Allied system of codenames for Japanese aircraft. He assigned feminine names to bombers and masculine names to fighters, a simple mnemonic that made identification much easier. This system gave us names like Zeke for the A6M0, Betty for the Mitsubishi G4M bomber, and Frank for the Nakajima Ki-84 fighter. The American and British militaries also had their own complex systems for naming equipment, which could be a source of confusion. The Army used designations like SCR-300 for a portable radio, while the Navy had its own system with 2- and 3-letter designators. To streamline this, the Joint Army-Navy (AN) system was introduced in late 1942 to standardize the naming of equipment intended for multi-service use. There was also the matter of naming entire operations. The code names for specific battles and campaigns were often chosen at random or for their poetic sound, with little relation to the operation itself. Names like Overlord for the Normandy invasion, Barbarossa for the invasion of the Soviet Union, and Torch for the North Africa campaign all carry a weight of history, a name that became synonymous with the event itself. They were small, symbolic labels assigned to vast undertakings. The war, with its vast production and immense scale, generated an alphabet soup of designations, a quiet, bureaucratic legacy that can still be found in the archives. It was a way to bring order to the chaos of conflict, to categorize the unthinkable and file it away. And then there were the quieter sounds, like the tick of a clock, a constant reminder of the time that passed. The war was a contest of whispered words and hidden machines, a silent battle fought in the shadows of the more famous conflicts. This is a collection of facts about the secrets that were kept, the codes that were broken, and the strange, quiet inventions that turned the tide of the war without most people ever knowing they existed. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. The American code machine, known as SIGABA, was so secure that it was never broken by the enemy during the entire war. Unlike the German Enigma, which was famously cracked, SIGABA used 15 rotors to scramble messages, making its letter-scrambling patterns exponentially more complex. The system was so secret that British personnel were not even allowed access to the machine itself, a rare exception in the close Allied partnership. The name SIGABA is not an acronym and does not stand for anything. It is simply a code word, a small piece of bureaucratic mystery. The German Enigma machine, in contrast, was broken very early in the war, thanks to the brilliant work of Polish mathematicians in the 1930s. They managed to copy the machine with the help of a German traitor and solved its letter-scrambling patterns, sharing their knowledge with the French and British. The intelligence derived from these decrypted messages was codenamed Ultra, and it was so secret that very few people knew about it. The Germans never found out the Allies could solve their codes, though they suspected it when their ability to sync Allied shipping slipped dramatically in 1942. A captured German weather ship provided one of the most valuable intelligence hauls of the war. The Germans used weather ships, often converted fishing vessels, to collect observations from remote parts of the ocean. In 1942, the British captured one of these ships, the Lauenburg, and recovered its Enigma codebooks, which allowed cryptanalysts to break the German naval codes used to communicate with U-boats in the Atlantic. By the end of 1942, the Allies were reading up to 4,000 Enigma intercepts every day, a quiet, paper-based victory that saved countless lives. The Allies also broke Japanese diplomatic codes, which they named Purple, and the intelligence from these messages was codenamed Magic. While Purple did not provide specific military intelligence, it gave Allied leaders vital information about Nazi weapons production and German plans, as the Japanese diplomats in Berlin and Rome were constantly reporting on their Axis partners. This was a small, ironic twist, Japanese communication playing a crucial role in the war in Europe. The American proximity fuse, known as the VT fuse, was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, second only to the Manhattan Project. It was a tiny radar device inside an artillery shell that could detonate the weapon in the proximity of its target, rather than on impact. This increased the lethality of anti-aircraft fire by a factor of 10, and by 1944, these fuses were being used to devastating effect against German ground troops at the Battle of the Bulge. The proximity fuse was so secret that the Pentagon refused to allow its use by other Allied nations for most of the war. It was only shared with the British when the Germans began systematically destroying London with V-1 rockets in 1944. The fuses were mass-produced primarily by women who assembled the delicate parts by hand, often under such secrecy that they were searched when they entered and left the plant and were not even allowed to bring in a purse. The British had their own strange, quiet arsenal of secret weapons, developed by the Special Operations Executive, SOE. Agents were parachuted behind enemy lines with devices that were more outlandish than anything in a spy novel. These included exploding rats, dead, skinned rodents stuffed with plastic explosive, designed to be placed in German boiler rooms. There were also time bombs disguised as bottles of Chianti, and neckties that concealed a secret code on a piece of silk. The SOE's research stations produced 150 different secret articles by 1942. Agents were equipped with one-man submarines that had a range of 400 miles and could carry enough explosives to sink a destroyer. An Electrolux vacuum cleaner was doctored to conceal a wireless, with aerials disguised as rope clotheslines or window sash cords. They even used skin dyes lasting up to 4 days, wrinkle creams that aged the skin, and plastic surgery performed by an eminent surgeon to help agents blend in. The Germans also had secret weapons, the most famous being the V2 rocket, a ballistic missile that could strike London from across the English Channel. The British first learned of the V2 through reconnaissance photographs taken in June 1943, which showed rockets casting shadows across the ground at the Peenemünde research site. The British intelligence report estimated the mass of each rocket at between 40 and 80 tons, a gross exaggeration of the actual weight of just under 13 tons. Despite the guesswork, the British recognized the threat and launched Operation Hydra, a massive bombing raid on Peenemünde on the night of August 17, 1943. The raid damaged the laboratories and test rigs, forcing the Germans to abandon their plans to manufacture the rocket there. The Germans tried to fool the Allies into thinking the damage was worse than it was by digging fake craters and painting black lines on the roofs, but the secret was out. The whole World War itself had a quiet, bureaucratic origin. The term World War I was coined by Time magazine in 1939, and the first use of World War II for the actual conflict came in the same publication on September 11, 1939. Before that, the conflict was known simply as the Great War. The word war itself, in the Germanic languages, seems to have been a borrowing from the French were, which came from a Frankish word meaning to bring about confusion. It was a small etymological detail, a word that meant to confuse, which was perhaps fitting for a conflict that was, in so many ways, a confusing, secret, and quiet battle of whispers and shadows. The quiet after the war was a strange, awkward silence, a time of paperwork and reckoning. This is a collection of facts about the aftermath, the administrative cleanups, the long shadows of decisions made in the heat of battle, and the quiet, often overlooked details of the world that emerged from the ashes. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. The U.S. War Production Board, the massive bureaucracy that had overseen the conversion of American industry to war production, ceased operations on November 1, 1945. It was a quiet administrative death, a sign that the emergency was over and the nation could begin to return to peacetime pursuits. The board had been a central part of the war effort, and its closure was a small, symbolic end to an era of total mobilization. The British Ministry of Food, which had rationed every aspect of the nation's diet, continued its work long after the guns fell silent. Food rationing did not fully end in the United Kingdom until 1954, nearly a decade after the war's conclusion. The scarcity of the war years had become a way of life, and it took years for the supply chains to return to normal. The ration book was a lingering reminder of the war's hardship. The U.S. Marshall Plan was officially named for Secretary of State George C. Marshall, a quiet tribute to the man who had been the architect of the American military's victory. The plan was a massive economic aid package designed to rebuild the shattered economies of Western Europe. It was a soft power offensive, a way to prevent the spread of communism through economic stability. The Nuremberg trials began on November 20, 1945, a legal reckoning for the architects of the Nazi regime. The trials were a slow, deliberate process, a careful examination of the crimes committed during the war. They were a small, legal step toward justice, a way to hold individuals accountable for the atrocities of the regime. The U.S. military drafted the Occupation Statute for Germany in 1945, a legal framework for the administration of the defeated nation. The statute outlined the powers of the Allied military governors and the limitations on the German government. It was a bureaucratic document, but it was also a blueprint for the reconstruction of a nation. The GI Bill was signed into law on June 22, 1944, a piece of legislation that would transform American society. The bill provided educational and housing benefits to returning veterans, a massive investment in the post-war generation. It was a quiet, legislative act that would shape the future of the country. The Soviet Berlin blockade began in 1948, a standoff that was a direct consequence of the division of Germany. The Soviets cut off all land access to West Berlin, hoping to starve the Western Allies out of the city. The Western Allies responded with the Berlin Airlift, a massive logistical operation that supplied the city by air. It was a quiet, cold war that began in the ashes of the hot one. The U.S. War Bride Act allowed 100,000 foreign women to immigrate to the United States to marry American soldiers. These women were a small, human consequence of the war, a quiet wave of immigration that changed the demographics of the nation. They were a reminder that the war had brought people together from across the world. The OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, was disbanded in October 1945, and it was replaced by the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947. The OSS had been the first centralized intelligence agency in the United States, and its successor would continue its work in the shadows. It was a quiet, bureaucratic transition, a shift from wartime to peacetime intelligence. The British National Service Act continued conscription until 1960, a quiet legacy of the war that maintained a large standing army. The act was a sign that the war had changed Britain forever, and that the nation could no longer rely on a small volunteer force. The draft was a lingering reminder of the demands of the war. The U.S. Japanese-American internment camps were closed by 1945, a quiet end to a shameful chapter in American history. The camps had been a violation of civil liberties, and their closure was a small step toward rectifying the injustice. The Japanese Americans who had been interned began the long process of rebuilding their lives. The United Nations Charter was signed in San Francisco on June 26, 1945. A hopeful act of international cooperation. The Charter was a document of peace, a way to prevent future wars through collective security. It was a quiet, symbolic beginning to a new era of international diplomacy. The U.S. war bonds were fully redeemed by 1950, a quiet end to a massive financial campaign. The bonds had been a way for ordinary Americans to contribute to the war effort, and their redemption was a small, financial settling of accounts. The bonds were a tangible connection to the war, a piece of paper that represented a share in the victory. The British Lend-Lease debt was not fully repaid until 2006, a quiet, administrative finality to a massive wartime loan. The loan had been a lifeline for Britain during the war, and its repayment was a small, fiscal act of closure. The final payment was a symbolic end to a long financial relationship. The U.S. occupation of Japan ended in 1952, a quiet end to a 7-year period of American military rule. The occupation had been a transformative period for Japan, and its end marked the beginning of a new era of sovereignty. The occupation was a quiet, administrative transition, a shift from military to civilian rule. The Soviet Gulag system continued post-war, a quiet, brutal legacy of the Stalinist regime. The camps were a system of forced labor, a way to silence dissent and exploit the population. The gulags were a dark, continuing echo of the war's brutality. The U.S. Marshall Plan gave $13 billion to Europe, a massive investment in the continent's recovery. The money was used to rebuild factories, roads, and bridges, a quiet, economic engine that drove the post-war boom. The plan was a massive act of reconstruction, a way to rebuild a continent. The British NHS, the National Health Service, was founded in 1948, a quiet, socialist legacy of the war. The NHS was a system of universal healthcare, a way to provide medical care for all citizens. It was a small legislative act that would define the British welfare state. The U.S. Truman Doctrine was announced in 1947, a policy of containing communism. The doctrine was a response to the Soviet threat, a small geopolitical shift that would define American foreign policy for decades. The doctrine was a quiet, ideological declaration, a statement of purpose in the new Cold War. The German Federal Republic was created in 1949, the foundation of West Germany. The new republic was a democratic state, a quiet, political beginning for a nation that had been shattered by war. The republic was a small, hopeful symbol of a new Germany. The U.S. Berlin airlift supplied 2 million tons of food, a massive logistical operation that saved the city of West Berlin. The airlift was a response to the Soviet blockade, and it was a triumph of American ingenuity and resolve. The airlift was a quiet, humanitarian act, a way to keep a city alive. The British King George VI died in 1952, a quiet, personal end for a monarch who had led his nation through the war. The king had been a symbol of British resilience, and his death was a small, symbolic end to an era. His daughter, Elizabeth, would ascend to the throne. The U.S. Eisenhower became president in 1953, a quiet, political transition from military hero to civilian leader. Eisenhower had been the supreme Allied commander in Europe, and his presidency was a bridge between the war and the post-war era. He was a quiet, steady leader for a nation at peace. The Soviet Stalin died in 1953, a quiet, personal end for the dictator who had led the Soviet Union through the war. Stalin's death was a small, political shift, a change in the leadership of the Soviet Union. The death was a quiet, historical moment, the end of an era. And finally, the U.S.-Korean War began in 1950, a quiet, bitter conflict that was a direct consequence of the division of Korea at the end of World War II. The war was a reminder that the peace was fragile, a small, cold war that had turned hot. It was a quiet, tragic continuation of the conflict that had never really ended. The system of paper and ink was as vital as any weapon, a silent army of words that fought for hearts and minds in a battle of ideas. This is a collection of facts about propaganda, the leaflets that fell from the sky, the newspapers that brought news to the front, and the quiet, persistent effort to sway opinion with words and images. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. The United States printed 1 billion propaganda leaflets for distribution in Europe, a paper blizzard that fell on occupied countries and German soldiers alike. This immense output, known as a leaflet campaign, was a testament to the belief that words could be as powerful as bombs. The pamphlets were designed to be persuasive, to undermine morale and encourage surrender. The British Political Warfare Executive was a secret organization dedicated to the art of propaganda. In France, they produced a newspaper specifically for the occupied population, a clandestine publication that offered an alternative to the Nazi-controlled press. The production and distribution of this paper was a dangerous operation, a quiet act of resistance. The German Signal magazine was a lavishly produced publication, published in 20 languages and distributed across Europe and beyond. It was a propaganda tool of the highest order, filled with glossy photographs and articles that presented the Nazi war effort in the most favorable light. It was a sophisticated piece of persuasion, designed to win the hearts and minds of neutral countries. The U.S. Office of War Information employed 3,000 writers, a vast workforce dedicated to crafting the official narrative of the war. These writers produced press releases, radio scripts, and films, all designed to build support for the war effort at home and abroad. It was a bureaucratic machine for shaping public opinion. The British Ministry of Information produced 2,000 posters per month, a constant stream of visual propaganda that covered walls and public spaces. These posters carried messages of national unity, warnings against gossip, and calls to save scrap metal. They were a quiet, constant presence in the lives of civilians, a reminder of the war's demands. The U.S. V-mail system was a remarkable piece of administrative ingenuity. Letters were photographed onto microfilm, reducing the weight of a 45-pound bag of mail to just 1.5 ounces. This allowed millions of letters to be shipped across the globe quickly and efficiently, a vital link between soldiers and their families. The German Parole newspaper was specifically printed for prisoners of war, a publication designed to demoralize captured soldiers and encourage them to cooperate with their captors. The paper contained news from home, but it was carefully selected to present a narrative that benefited the German war effort. The U.S. Stars and Stripes newspaper was first published in 1942, a newspaper written by and for American soldiers. It was an independent voice, covering the news of the war with a perspective that was uniquely its own. The paper was a source of information and a connection to the world back home. The British Daily Express was the most popular troops paper, a familiar voice from home that was distributed to soldiers across all theaters of the war. It was a connection to the ordinary world, a reminder of the life they were fighting to protect. The U.S. Yank magazine was a weekly publication for U.S. troops, filled with articles, cartoons, and pin-up girls. It was a reminder of what they were fighting for, a taste of American culture in the middle of a foreign war. The Japanese Shinbun was a propaganda sheet, a newspaper published by the Japanese military for distribution in occupied territories. It presented the Japanese perspective on the war, attempting to legitimize their control over captured lands. The US OWI distributed 100,000 photos per month, a vast visual record of the war that was used to illustrate newspapers and magazines. These images were carefully selected to convey the official narrative, a curated view of the conflict. The British radio broadcasts were the primary news source for many soldiers, a lifeline of information from the BBC. The radio was a source of comfort and connection, a way to hear the voice of home. The U.S. Victory Mail was used for censorship as well as communication. All letters were photographed and processed, and any sensitive information was removed. The system was an efficient way to control the flow of information. The German Völkischer Beobachter was the Nazi Party's official newspaper, a platform for the rhetoric of the regime. It was a daily dose of propaganda, shaping the views of the German population with its constant stream of ideology. The US leaflet campaigns specifically targeted German soldiers with promises of safe conduct and good treatment if they surrendered. These leaflets were printed in German and dropped behind enemy lines, a silent, paper-based appeal to the enemy's survival instinct. The British BBC was the trusted source for resistance fighters in occupied Europe. The broadcasts from London contained coded messages and news of Allied advances, a lifeline for those fighting in the shadows. The US poster campaign used 1,000 different designs, each one a carefully crafted piece of visual persuasion. These posters were everywhere, a constant reminder of the war's demands and the need for sacrifice. The Japanese propaganda was largely ineffective, due to its heavy-handed approach and its reliance on threats and intimidation. The Japanese military's attempts to demoralize Allied soldiers were generally met with defiance. The U.S. Life magazine was sent to troops, a slice of American life that was a welcome distraction from the tedium of war. The magazine was a reminder of home, a connection to the world they had left behind. The British Punch magazine had war cartoons that offered a satirical take on the conflict. These cartoons were a source of humor, a way to process the absurdities of war with a light-hearted touch. The U.S. War Diary was kept by every unit, a daily record of events that was used for historical purposes and for after-action reports. The diaries were a dry, factual account of the war's progress. The German Wochenschau was the weekly newsreel, a film that showed the German war effort in the best possible light. It was a powerful propaganda tool, shaping the way the German people saw the war. The U.S. newsreel theaters showed combat footage, a vivid depiction of the war that was unlike anything seen before. The newsreels were a source of information and propaganda, a way for the public to see the war. And finally, the British ministry censored all outgoing letters, a vast and silent operation that controlled the flow of information from the front. Every letter home was read, and any sensitive information was removed. It was a quiet, bureaucratic effort to maintain operational security, a reminder that in a war of words, the most powerful weapon is often the one you don't speak. The roads were rivers of mud and metal, and the trucks that moved along them were the veins of the armies. This is a collection of facts about the wheels that turned the war, the vehicles that carried the food, the fuel, and the ammunition, and the roads that carried the vehicles. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. The Red Ball Express was a massive truck convoy system that operated in France after the D-Day landings, a relentless supply line that kept the Allied armies moving eastward. The system was conceived in a hurried 36-hour meeting and began operating on August 25, 1944. At its peak, it operated nearly 6,000 vehicles, carrying about 12,500 tons of supplies each day. The term Red Ball itself had a history that predated the war. It came from the Santa Fe Railroad, which used it around 1892 to describe express shipping for priority freight and perishables. The red balls marked the trains and the tracks cleared for their use, a visual symbol of priority that was later adopted by the truck convoys. Nearly 75% of the Red Ball Express drivers were African American, a fact that is often overlooked in the history of the war. The Army had relegated black soldiers primarily to service and supply roles, believing they were not suited for combat. Yet these men drove through the night, under blackout conditions, delivering the fuel and ammunition that made Patton's advance possible. The primary truck of the Red Ball Express was the GMC 2.5-ton Deuce and a Half, a vehicle that became the workhorse of the American Army. It was a six-wheel drive vehicle, meaning it could climb a 65% gradient and slog through mud, ice, and snow that would stop other trucks. General George S. Patton himself remarked that, "The 2.5-ton truck is our most valuable weapon." The Deuce and a Half was also known for its impressive production run. By 1945, some 562,000 had been produced, a record for truck production. It was a sturdy, reliable machine that could carry just about anything, from 150 cases of sea rations to 15 55-gallon drums. The Germans had their own version of the light military vehicle, the Kübelwagen, which was designed by Ferdinand Porsche based on the Volkswagen Beetle. The Kübelwagen was a rear-wheel drive vehicle with a rear-mounted, air-cooled engine, making it light and nimble. It was not as powerful as the Jeep, but its lightweight, low gearing, and high clearance gave it off-road performance that was comparable to many four-wheel drive vehicles. The Kübelwagen was powered initially by a modest 23.5 horsepower engine, later upgraded to 25 horsepower. It was a vehicle designed for a life measured in months, but it proved remarkably durable and adaptable. Over 50,000 were built by the end of the war, and they served on every front, from the sands of North Africa to the frozen steppes of Russia. Another remarkable vehicle was the Duckwu, popularly known as the Duck. It was an amphibious truck, a six-wheel drive vehicle that could travel on land and water. It was based on the Deuce-and-a-half chassis, with the addition of a watertight hull and a propeller. The Duckwu was initially rejected by the military, but it proved its worth in a dramatic rescue off the coast of Massachusetts. A Coast Guard patrol craft had run aground in heavy surf, and conventional boats could not reach it. An experimental Duckwu happened to be in the area and rescued the stranded crew without any trouble, and the military opposition to the design vanished. Over 21,000 UKWs were manufactured during the war, and they were used in every amphibious invasion. They could carry a crew of 3 and a substantial payload, moving at 6.5 miles per hour on water and up to 55 on land. The German army, despite its reputation for mechanization, relied heavily on horses for transport. At the start of the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht had some 400,000 horses under its control, pulling artillery and supplies. The horses were the forgotten soldiers of the German army, a living engine that moved the war across Europe. The Red Ball Express was a huge undertaking, but it was not the only supply route. There were other named convoys as well, including the Green Diamond, the White Ball, the Lions Express, and the ABC Express. The Red Ball, however, was the most famous, a symbol of the logistical effort that fueled the Allied advance. The roads themselves were a constant challenge. In the Soviet Union, the seasonal mud, known as Rasputitsa, was a formidable obstacle, a natural defensive advantage that slowed the German advance to a crawl. The mud was so thick that it could suck the boots from a soldier's feet, and it turned the roads into a quagmire of muck and misery. The Red Ball Express ran for just 83 days, from August to November 1944, but its impact was immense. It delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies to the front lines, a lifeline that kept the American army fighting. It was a short-lived but vital operation, a testament to the power of logistics. The trucks on the Red Ball Express often ignored the official speed limits, disabling their engine governors to travel faster than the prescribed 56 miles per hour. They drove day and night, with drivers sleeping in shifts, pushing themselves and their vehicles to the limit. It was a desperate, exhausting race to keep the front lines supplied. The drivers faced constant danger, from German ambushes and the threat of the Luftwaffe, though by 1944, German air power was so reduced that the convoys were rarely attacked from the sky. The real enemies were the mud, the exhaustion, and the constant strain of the job. The French railways, which had been bombed into ruins before the invasion, were slowly repaired, and portable gasoline pipelines were deployed, eventually making the Red Ball Express obsolete. But for a few crucial months, the trucks were the only way to get the supplies to the front, and they did their job with remarkable efficiency. The jerrycan was another essential piece of logistics, a German-designed fuel container that was far superior to the British and American designs. The Allied cans, nicknamed flimsies, were prone to leaking and often lost between 15 and 50% of their contents. In contrast, the German can was a masterpiece of industrial design. The jerrycan was made from just 2 pieces of stamped steel, with a single weld around the middle, making it strong and leak-proof. It had 3 handles, allowing one soldier to carry 2 cans, and it had a cap that could be opened by hand, without tools. It was a simple, brilliant design that was eventually copied by the Allies. The Duku was also known for its ability to cross the English Channel, a feat that proved its seaworthiness. It was a versatile vehicle, used for transporting goods, troops, and even for rescuing stranded sailors. It was a true amphibian, a vehicle that could go anywhere the war took it. The Kübelwagen's flat underbelly allowed it to slide over snow and mud, rather than becoming bogged down. It was a vehicle designed for the conditions of the Eastern Front, where the mud and snow were as much a threat as the enemy. It was a humble machine, but it was essential for the German war effort. The Red Ball Express was a microcosm of the war itself, a vast, chaotic, and often dangerous operation that was driven by the need to keep the armies moving. It was a testament to the importance of logistics, the art of moving things from where they are to where they need to be. And then there was the sound of the truck engines, a constant drone on the roads of Europe, a sound that signaled the war's relentless advance. The clothes on a soldier's back were a second skin, a barrier against the elements and a uniform of belonging. This is a collection of facts about the fabrics, the colors, and the tailoring of military clothing, the materials that shape the silhouette of the war. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. The US OD color for olive drab was standardized in 1941, a specific shade of green-brown that was adopted for all Army uniforms and equipment. The standardization was a logistical necessity, ensuring that all fabric and gear would match, simplifying supply chains and reducing waste. The color became iconic, a visual shorthand for the American soldier. The British khaki was a color, not a cloth, a term that comes from the Urdu word for dusty or earth-colored. The British Army adopted khaki uniforms in the late 19th century as a form of camouflage, a practical choice for service in India and Africa. The color was a departure from the bright red coats of earlier eras, a shift toward the modern utilitarian soldier. The German Feldgrau, or field gray, was adopted in 1910, a specific shade of gray-green that was the standard for the German army for decades. The color was chosen for its ability to blend into the European landscape, a subtle, muted tone that was less visible than the brighter colors of the past. It was a practical, understated color for a modern military. The U.S. Ike jacket was a short, waist-length jacket named for General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who championed its adoption. The jacket was a practical design, tailored to be smart and comfortable, and it was a departure from the longer, more formal tunics of the past. The jacket was a small piece of personal style, a uniform that was also a fashion statement. The British battle dress was introduced in 1937, a practical uniform that was designed for comfort and mobility. The uniform was a simple, utilitarian design, with a blouson jacket and trousers that were worn with gaiters. It was a uniform for the modern soldier, a practical outfit for a new kind of war. The U.S. parachute silk was a valuable material, and it was often used for escape maps, a practical repurposing of a scarce resource. The silk was light and strong, and it was easy to conceal. The maps were a quiet, essential tool for downed airmen, a lifeline printed on a piece of a parachute. The Japanese uniform was a light green, a color that was chosen for its ability to blend into the vegetation of the Pacific Islands. The color was a practical choice for jungle warfare, but it also had a symbolic meaning, representing the harmony of the soldier with nature. The U.S. cotton sateen was used for summer uniforms, a lightweight, breathable fabric that was comfortable in the heat. The sateen had a smooth, lustrous finish, but it was also durable, a practical choice for a working uniform. The fabric was a small comfort in the sweltering heat of the Pacific. The British wool was used for winter tunics, a warm, durable fabric that was essential for service in the cold. The wool was thick and heavy, providing insulation against the elements. The fabric was a practical necessity, a barrier against the cold. The German P-dot camouflage was used by the Waffen-SS, a distinctive pattern that was designed to break up the outline of the soldier. The pattern was a sophisticated attempt at camouflage, a small visual detail that made the soldier harder to see. The US M43 field jacket was designed for layering, a practical piece of clothing that could be worn over other garments. The jacket had a drawstring waist and a button-in liner, making it adaptable to different weather conditions. The jacket was a functional, versatile design. The Italian grigio verde, or gray-green, was the standard color for Italian uniforms, a distinctive shade that was chosen for its ability to blend into the Mediterranean landscape. The color was a practical choice, a muted tone that was less visible than brighter colors. The US HBT, or herringbone twill, was a durable cotton fabric that was used for uniforms in the Pacific. The fabric was a practical choice for jungle warfare, as it was strong and breathable, and it was often dyed in a camouflaged pattern. The HBT was a workhorse fabric, a reliable material for a harsh environment. The British gaiters were worn to keep dirt and debris out of the soldiers' boots, a simple, practical accessory. The gaiters were made of canvas or leather, and they were a standard part of the uniform. They were a small, practical detail, a way to keep the soldiers' feet dry. The US leather boots were standard until 1943, when they were replaced by a more durable but less comfortable boot. The leather boots were a traditional design, and they were a source of pride for the soldiers who wore them. The boots were a sturdy, reliable piece of footwear. The German jackboots were knee-high leather boots, a distinctive part of the German uniform. The boots were a practical piece of footwear, providing protection against mud and cold. The boots were a symbol of the German military, a piece of its identity. The US M1 liner was made of a fiberglass type, a lightweight, durable material that was used to line the helmet. The liner was a modern material, a small technological advance that made the helmet more comfortable. The liner was a small, often overlooked piece of equipment. The British sweater was a jersey, a thick woolen pullover that was used for warmth. The sweater was a practical piece of clothing, a way to stay warm in the cold. The jersey was a simple, essential garment. The US T-shirt was issued as underwear, a comfortable, practical garment that was worn under the uniform. The T-shirt was a modern innovation, a departure from the traditional undershirt. The T-shirt was a small, everyday item that is now ubiquitous. The German tunic had 4 pockets, a practical design that allowed soldiers to carry essential items. The tunic was a standard piece of the uniform, and the pockets were a functional detail. The tunic was a simple, practical garment. The US coat was a greatcoat in winter, a heavy woolen overcoat that was worn over the uniform. The greatcoat was a warm, bulky garment that was essential for service in the cold. The coat was a practical necessity, a barrier against the winter weather. The British greatcoat was standard for officers, a formal, tailored overcoat that was a symbol of rank. The greatcoat was a warm, stylish garment that was a source of pride for the officers who wore it. The coat was a small piece of class distinction. The US cap was a garrison cap or overseas cap, a simple folding cap that was worn with the uniform. The cap was a practical piece of headgear, easy to store and comfortable to wear. The cap was a small, iconic piece of the uniform. The German cap was a field cap with a flap, a practical design that provided warmth and protection. The cap was a simple, functional piece of headgear, a standard part of the uniform. The cap was a small, essential detail. And finally, the US ribbon bars were for unit citations, small, colorful strips of fabric that were worn on the uniform to denote awards and decorations. The ribbons were a quiet, visual record of a soldier's service, a small, colorful history worn on the chest. They were a silent, visible honor, a symbol of service and sacrifice. The world of war was filled with sound, a constant, overwhelming noise that could drive a man to the edge of madness. This is a collection of facts about those sounds, the specific, identifiable noises that defined the war, the signals and warnings, and the strange, acoustic signatures of machines and men. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. The German Stuka siren, called the Jericho trumpet, was a wind-driven propeller attached to the fixed landing gear of the aircraft. This small, ugly contraption would produce a terrifying, screaming shriek as the plane dived, a sound that was designed to demoralize the enemy. It was a psychological weapon, a noise that spread fear long before the bombs fell. The siren also slowed the aircraft by about 10 miles per hour, a small aerodynamic price for a terrifying sonic signature. The British air raid siren had a specific two-tone pitch, a rising and falling wail that was instantly recognizable. It was a sound of warning, a signal that sent civilians scrambling for shelter. The sound was an intrusion into everyday life, a constant reminder of the danger above. It also became known as the moaning Minnie, a darkly humorous nickname for a terrifying sound. The US M1 rifle made a distinctive ping sound when the empty clip was ejected from the rifle's internal magazine. This sound became a piece of military folklore, with many soldiers believing that it could alert the enemy to a moment of vulnerability. Whether or not this was true, the sound is indelibly linked to the weapon in the popular imagination. It was the sound of an empty magazine, a signal to reload. The Soviet Katyusha rocket launcher made a distinctive howling sound as the rockets were launched, a rising shriek that was terrifying to those on the receiving end. The rockets were nicknamed Stalin's organ by the German troops, a reference to the sound of the multiple launchers. The sound was as fearsome as the rockets themselves, a harbinger of a devastating barrage. The German V-1 flying bomb, with its pulse-jet engine, produced a distinctive buzzing sound, a constant, droning hum that could be heard for miles. The sound was so characteristic that the weapon was nicknamed the buzz bomb or doodlebug by the British. The engine's noise was created by a series of rapidly opening and closing shutters at the front, creating a pulsating buzz. When the buzzing stopped, it meant the engine had cut out and the bomb was about to crash to Earth. The British D-Day silence was a deception measure, a tactic used by the RAF to lull the Germans into a false sense of security before the invasion. For weeks before the landings, the Allies avoided electronic warfare over the beaches, letting the German radar operators grow complacent. Then, at the critical moment, they unleashed a barrage of jamming and decoys, overwhelming the German defenses. The sound of radio traffic was a constant presence on the battlefield, a crackling, distorted stream of voices and code. The radios were often unreliable, and the sound quality was poor, but they were the only way to communicate across the noise and chaos of battle. The radio was a lifeline, a fragile connection to the command. The Japanese banzai shouts were loud, a collective yell of soldiers charging into battle. The cry was a form of psychological warfare, an attempt to intimidate the enemy with the sheer volume of the sound. The sound was a defiant, aggressive roar, a signal of the attack. The U.S. bugle calls were used for all activities, from reveille to taps. The bugle was a simple instrument, but its sound was the rhythm of the day, a constant reminder of the military discipline that governed the soldier's life. The bugle was the voice of the camp. The British pipe band was used for marching, the skirl of the bagpipes, a distinctive sound on the battlefield. The pipes were a traditional instrument, a sound that was both stirring and melancholy. The sound of the pipes was a connection to home, to Scotland and to the Highlands. The German Panzer engines were loud, the roar of the powerful Maybach engines a constant sound on the battlefield. The sound was a warning, a signal that the tanks were coming. The rumble of the engines was a sound of power, a noise that shook the ground. The U.S. aircraft engine test was a constant sound, the roar of engines being run up on the airfields. The sound was a sign of activity, of preparation, of the constant readiness that was the price of air superiority. The sound of the engines was a constant in the life of the airmen. The British klaxon was used on ships, a loud electric horn that was used for alerts and commands. The klaxon was a harsh, piercing sound, a noise that cut through the noise of the ship. The klaxon was the voice of the captain, a signal for action. The U.S. whistle was used for commands, a sharp, piercing sound that could be heard over the noise of the battlefield. The whistle was a simple instrument, but it was a vital tool for communication. The whistle was the voice of the sergeant, a sound that demanded attention. The German whistle was used by officers, a similar tool for giving commands. The sound of the whistle was a familiar sound on the battlefield, a signal that cut through the noise of the battle. The whistle was a sound of authority, a call to order. The U.S. artillery had a distinctive boom, the sound of the guns firing a deep, thunderous roar that could be felt as much as heard. The sound of the artillery was a constant on the battlefield, a background noise that never stopped. The artillery was the music of war. The British mortar had a thump sound, a distinctive hollow pop as the round was launched. The sound was a signal of danger, a warning that a high-arching bomb was about to fall. The mortar was a silent killer, but the sound of its launch was a giveaway. The U.S. mines were silent but deadly. The anti-tank mines would detonate with a sudden, ear-splitting bang, but they gave no warning of their presence. The silence of the mine was its deadliest weapon. The Japanese aircraft engines had a distinct drone, a sound that was different from the American and British engines. The sound was a signal, a warning that the enemy was in the air. The sound was a constant presence in the Pacific. The U.S. C-47 engine was a reliable rumble, the sound of the twin Pratt & Whitney engines a constant on the airfields and in the sky. The C-47 was a workhorse, and its engine was the sound of work. The sound was a steady, dependable drone. The British Spitfire engine had a distinctive whine, the sound of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine a unique musical note. The sound was a source of pride for the British, a symbol of their defiance. The Spitfire's engine was a sound of hope. The U.S. Navy used a bell for shifts, the sound of the ship's bell a traditional timekeeper. The bell was a constant on the ship, a reminder of the routine of naval life. The sound of the bell was a quiet, familiar sound in the vastness of the ocean. The German U-boat ping was the sound of sonar, a high-pitched, echoing tone that was used to locate enemy ships. The sound was a source of terror for the U-boat crews, a signal that the hunter had become the hunted. The ping was a sound of death, a signal that the depth charges were coming. And finally, the British silence in the phony war was eerie, a quiet that fell over the Western Front after the initial chaos of the invasion of Poland. It was the silence of waiting, a strange, unsettling hush that was broken only by the occasional patrol or air raid. The silence was a prelude, a calm before the storm of 1940. The war left behind a trail of loose ends, questions with no answers, and objects that vanished into thin air. This is a collection of facts about the unresolved, the forgotten, and the strange, quiet mysteries that remain unsolved to this day. It is the final collection, a quiet inventory of the things that could not be catalogued, the small, forgotten details that were left behind in the vast machinery of the war. Here is a quiet fact to rest on. Allied pilots flying over Europe during the war reported strange, unexplained aerial phenomena that came to be known as Foo Fighters. They described glowing orbs, fast-moving lights, and odd shapes that flew alongside their planes, sometimes maneuvering in ways that seemed impossible for any known aircraft. The U.S. military leadership initially dismissed the reports as combat stress or fatigue, but the sheer number of accounts from experienced pilots eventually made them harder to ignore. To this day, no definitive explanation for the Foo Fighters has ever emerged. The Battle of Los Angeles in February 1942 was another strange event that was never fully explained. In the early hours of February 25, radar systems detected what appeared to be hostile activity 120 miles west of the city, setting off air raid sirens. The 37th Coastal Artillery Brigade fired 1,400 shells into the sky, while residents reported sightings of Japanese aircraft, paratroopers, and even unidentified flying objects. In the end, the city faced no actual danger, and the U.S. Navy credited the chaos to heightened fears. Yet many felt that no explanation provided so far fully explains the events of that night. The fate of the Columbus Globe, a special model made for high-ranking Nazi officials, remains a mystery. Manufactured by a Berlin-based company in the 1930s, this globe became a symbol of authoritarian ambitions. After the war, it vanished. While similar globes from the era still exist, none have been definitively traced back to the original. It may have been lost in the chaos of the war's final days, or taken as a souvenir by a soldier who has kept it hidden ever since. One of the most enduring mysteries of World War II is how the German army in the Netherlands discovered the hiding place of the Frank family in 1944. Nearly 80 years later, it is still unclear who betrayed them. In 2022, a book claimed to have finally solved the mystery, but the publisher later withdrew it after experts strongly disputed the evidence. The truth of the betrayal remains unknown. The story of the mysterious gold train is another unresolved puzzle. Many believe the German army loaded a train with gold, art, treasure, and other valuables as they realized they were losing the war. The train was supposedly hidden in a sealed tunnel and has never been discovered. After the war, the Polish military searched for the train but found nothing, and no proof has been found to show it ever existed. In recent years, 2 Polish men claimed to have heard a deathbed confession revealing the train's location, but once again, no gold train was found. The burning of the Normandy, a French ocean liner, was another baffling event. Destroyed by fire just 2 months after Hitler declared war on the United States, the liner was ruined in a matter of hours. Had Nazi saboteurs caused its destruction, or were Hitler sympathizers behind the disastrous arson job? The question remains unanswered. The sinking of the USS Tang was a tragedy of unexpected proportions. A U.S. submarine charged with tracking and destroying Japanese ships in the Formosa Strait, the Tang had sunk more enemy ships than any other U.S. submarine or surface vessel in the Pacific. During a battle in October 1944, a torpedo malfunctioned and circled back, striking the Tang itself and sinking it. The last torpedo destroyed the most unexpected victim of all, its own boat. An advertisement that appeared in the New Yorker 16 days before Pearl Harbor raised troubling questions for the FBI. The seemingly innocuous ad was for a new dice game called The Deadly Double. It aroused suspicion because it might have been placed by German or Japanese spies as a means of notifying their agents in the United States that war was about to erupt. Whether it was a bizarre coincidence or a coded warning has never been determined. One of the most unlikely clandestine missions of the war involved Winston Churchill's desire to own a live platypus. In March 1943, Churchill asked Australian Prime Minister John Curtin to send him 6 of the unusual egg-laying mammals. Biologist David Flay insisted that 6 would not survive the journey, and he captured a young male platypus he named Winston to send instead. The platypus was put aboard a ship with 50,000 specially chosen earthworms for the 6-week voyage, but the trip took longer than anticipated, and the platypus died just days before the ship reached Liverpool. After the war, a tremendous amount of unissued German military equipment and supplies were discovered in depots, warehouses, and even in the hands of local populations who had looted abandoned bases. The German supply and distribution systems were far from perfect, and the war ended before everything that was produced could be shipped and issued. Entire crates of uniforms could be forgotten in the back room of a warehouse. Decades later, stacks of unissued tunics and trousers still appeared at shows in Germany. The sheer scale of surplus was a testament to industrial overproduction. More than 330 surface vessels were sunk in the Caribbean and its approaches during the first 18 months following Pearl Harbor. This secret, forgotten battle involved German and Italian submarines rampaging through the Caribbean, nearly severing the vital oil lifeline from Venezuela and the bauxite mines in Suriname. The aircraft and units of the U.S. 6th Air Force, sometimes called the Forgotten Air Force, saw undocumented combat in one-on-one actions that have largely eluded historians. The Battle of Heligoland Bight in December 1939 was the first air conflict of the war to be given a name. 24 RAF Wellingtons were scrambled to attack German warships at Wilhelmshaven. Only half of them made it back. 59 airmen died in the space of an hour, and of those, only 12 were recovered for burial on land. This catastrophic loss forced Bomber Command to switch from daytime to nighttime missions, a decision that would define the rest of the air war. Today, it is a forgotten chapter of the conflict. The Battle of Heligoland Bight was also the first time that radar was used to direct German fighters to the bomber force. An experimental German radar station had detected the Wellingtons when they were some 70 miles out on their approach flight. The airmen commanders, still thinking in terms of World War I, had been caught off guard by the new technology. It was a quiet, technological shift that changed the nature of aerial warfare forever. The defense of the Panama Canal was a classic instance of point defense. During the first year of America's war, the canal was viewed as the next obvious target of Axis aggression from both the Atlantic and Pacific approaches. The extremely dispersed units of the 6th Air Force, defending a vast geographic region stretching from British Guyana to the Galapagos Islands, evolved markings and tactics unique within the Army Air Forces. They are now largely forgotten, a quiet, overlooked chapter of the war. The 6th Air Force, despite its mission of defending the canal, was soon plunged into the shooting war. The defenders of the canal realized that the standard camouflage prescribed by the USAF did not work in the tropical environment, and they evolved unique markings. They also relied upon a system of unit numbers and color coding of aircraft components, such as prop spinners and fin tips, rather than the standard code identifiers used elsewhere. The U.S. 6th Air Force was nicknamed the Forgotten Air Force, and for good reason. Unlike their combat brethren in the European and Pacific theaters, the units, aircraft, and airmen of this force have been largely ignored in the vast body of literature published since the war. They served in obscurity, defending a vital strategic asset that never came under direct attack. The tiny fishing trawlers and other small vessels used to collect weather data for the German military were often converted into clandestine weather stations. They would remain at sea for 3 to 5 weeks, transmitting their reports in cipher via Enigma machines. But their radio reports also exposed their location to British direction-finding systems, and the captured materials from boarded weather ships provided invaluable intelligence to Bletchley Park. Their silence was just as valuable as their broadcasts. The U.S. military had nearly 10,000 officers who had completed graduate-level training in meteorology by the end of the war. At the start of the war, the U.S. had only a few hundred trained meteorologists. This massive training program, designed by the Swedish meteorologist Carl Gustaf Rossby, transformed weather forecasting from a guessing game into a rigorous applied science. It was a quiet, intellectual revolution that would have implications long after the war was over. The quiet moment before sleep is a good time for the smallest of details, for the things that were counted and measured and then forgotten. The war was a time of huge numbers, of millions of men and billions of bullets, but it was also a time of small, precise quantities. The numbers are still falling, settling into the dark like dust. The final minute drops the energy to a near whisper. There is no grand conclusion. The voice acknowledges the listener is likely asleep. It suggests that the largest army in history has now shrunk to a footnote in a drifting mind. Deliver the very last fact, specific, quiet, and irrelevant, and then let the audio fade to a soft, 30-second silence or the hum of a recording machine spooling down. Here is a final, quiet thought. Perhaps the strangest legacy of the war is the silence that followed it. The silence of the guns, the silence of the cities, the silence of the millions of men who never came home. It is a silence that can still be felt, a quiet, enduring trace of the conflict that consumed the world. And in that silence, we find a small, quiet peace. Good night.